Hello and welcome to a new format on my YouTube channel. It's called Ralph on Air, and these are segments and pieces from interviews and conversations I had elsewhere. I use them for my own video and audio archive, but I thought I might share them with you as well. Some of you, which I'm very grateful for, are interested in what I have to say, and sometimes it can be a hassle to look for it on Facebook and X on YouTube. So I want everything consolidated on my YouTube channel. As you can see in the thumbnail, it's very clear from when the video is, from which greater, larger video it was taken. So I hope it is something that you can enjoy. And this first format, this first episode in this new format is a conversation I had with Raymond Ibrahim. And as you can tell, it's a very long conversation that we had, but I think it's absolutely worthwhile to watch it in its entirety. There will be shorter clips as well that I will post on social media, but I can only recommend it to take a look. I think this is a really great conversation that we had, and we touch on many of the important issues of the day. So without any further ado, here it is, and enjoy.
In Vienna, if 95% of a school class are Arab Muslims, how exactly will they integrate with the remaining 5%? It's the other way around. We have stories of schoolgirls, again, non-Muslim schoolgirls, who are now starting to veil themselves because that's the only way for them to be left alone. The so-called grooming gangs, which is, in my opinion, a euphemism for rape gangs. Well, they're also rapists who are Austrian. Yes, but that doesn't mean you bring additional ones from somewhere else.
Because that is the net result. People get angry. Are they doing this to anger whites against blacks?
It's almost an attempt to eradicate the history of peoples that have some form of continuous history over centuries, if not millennia.
Do they find it ironic that a foreign religion is now being forced down their throat? And do they care?
This is just complete madness. Everything human possible has to be done to stop illegal migration.
Okay, Ralph, I'm really happy to have you here with me because I'm here in Europe. I've been meeting a lot of Europeans, but you come from an area and your background can actually speak to a topic that has kind of been growing in my mind and I've been seeing a lot of, something that's come on my radar, which is basically Austria in general and Vienna in particular. As you know, I kind of monitor and follow Islam in Europe, migration problems and that sort of thing. And once in a while, I'll get these weird stories that come out from that country and that city, including, and therefore you can, verify and validate and expound on what I'm about to say, but including that Vienna apparently now has more Muslim students than it does native Austrians or Viennese, is one story which I'd like to hear about. And the other one is, and this again is very near and dear to what I do. I write about military history and battles. So, the siege of Vienna, 1683, Jan Sobieski, the Polish king, came down the Kallenberg Hill, if I pronounce that correct.
Oh, perfect pronunciation.
Okay, yeah. Good. And essentially saved Vienna. And that was a well-known date and heroic incident. And the Viennese, of course, were very grateful. And so apparently a monument was commissioned by the Viennese Council, or Poland offered it. Anyway, it was agreed to, and the monument has been made, and then all of a sudden the Viennese Council rejected it, saying, no, this promotes Islamophobia, xenophobia, hate, etc., etc. So, from an area, Vienna, which was sort of at the crossroads of the cross and the crescent warfare, the siege of Vienna, to what it's become now. What is this? What's going on? How do you explain it all?
Well, sometimes you have these stories right where you feel you have to double check them because they seem so crass or so crude.
Surreal.
Yeah, exactly. So surreal to say it can't be true. But in this case, it is true. Now, if we want to be a little bit more precise, it's in public middle schools, the number of Muslim students is 48%. So they outnumber Christian students. And these numbers come from the city of Vienna. So this is not, some private investigator or some shady right-wing conspiratorial web page or something. No, these are official
governmental statistics.
These are governmental statistics. It's interesting because in private schools, right, there's only 7%. So it shows you once again this phenomenon that Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs, where you have the very districts of Vienna where the parties rule that are most in favor of open borders and pro-migration, of course, also the districts where you have the most private schools. So if you then take because that's the average, so when we say 48%, that's the average. So you have areas where you have also primary schools that are now 95% Arab speaking. You're a native Arab speaker, so you know yourself that German and Arab, not much commonality. So this is not a way I say, oh, don't worry, you go to this school and 2 weeks later everybody speaks the same language. And this is an issue. It's a particular issue because what of course you then create is a condition where especially the members of the working class, right, they lose access to social mobility via education. Because what you then do is you turn more or less teachers who are supposed to convey, mathematics and literature and, geography, what you're supposed to learn in school, they basically are supposed to become agents of integration. But of course, they have neither the training to do so, nor do they have the language skills. Plus, there's also the cultural gap. There are plenty of stories. Now, these are anecdotal, fair enough. But at some point, if you have enough anecdotes, it's still not data, but let's say, it paints a picture of daily lived reality. I think that's a fair way to put it. For example, when you have female teachers, right, that the parents of pupils, but also the pupils themselves, right, have absolutely no respect, right? They say, no, I don't have to listen to a female authority because they recognize the concept of a female authority. We had a story that was about 5 years ago, where the section of the Vienna city government that is responsible for kindergartens was issuing, they cannot really issue orders how kindergarten teachers are supposed to dress, so it was more like a recommendation. And they said that they asked particularly female kindergarten teachers to kind of dress more modestly because Muslim parents who pick up their children, there were complaints that they might have, a top that was shoulder-free or a skirt that ended above the knee or something like this. So at least in urban areas, when we talk about Islam in Europe, at this point it is fair to say, and that's not being hyperbolic, to speak about the Islamization of Europe. Give you another story. There is not really a park, but like a free area in Vienna. It's like Hyde Park in Vienna, if you want. It's close to the river. It's usually where people meet and where they barbecue, and for people to come together. And it has been like this for at least 2 or 3 decades. And now you have the situation where native Austrians, if one wants to use this term, or non-Muslim Austrians, right, are driven away from these areas for a very simple reason, because in Austria, as in many Central European countries, pork is a favorite item on the menu. So when they bring their pork steaks or their tenderloins to these public barbecue places, of course, the Muslim families that tell them, you have to go. You cannot have your pork there. And
what do the authorities have to say about this sort of thing?
Well, this is the thing, right? The authorities, if they're being called, right, they can do something. But overall, what's happening, as you know, most people then acquiesce. You don't really pick up the phone and call the police. Some people do, right? And then usually something is happening. But it's a temporary fix because hypothetically you would have then to do your barbecue under police protection. And that kind of takes away the fun from doing it in the first place. So
one culture is bullying the other and one is acquiescing.
Yeah, and you see this also on a higher level, the one that you mentioned, because the story you told is absolutely correct, right? This was also supported by the Polish government, that on the Kahlenberg, where there's also a university, the pedestal for the monument is already there, so pretty much everything was in place. It was just the statue of Sobieski on, I think he was supposed to be him on a horse, to be put on there. And it was an official member of the Social Democratic Party who said precisely what you said, right? That we cannot have this monument because it would support anti-Islam or Islamophobic feelings, which is, it's a very odd thing that 300 years or more than about, give or take 300 over 300 years after you successfully broke the siege of Vienna and drove out the Muslim occupiers of the land, that now you more or less subjugate yourself, are subservient.
Willingly subjugate
yourself. And you see something else, which I think is potentially even more threatening, and something that you have written on about as well, is this odd idea that somehow movements like the Social Democrats or left movements, that they can make them their new voters, right? This idea of if you just meet them halfway, then they will become, quote unquote, our people. But of course, what's truly happening is, and we haven't seen that well, we have seen it in the UK. You see it partially in France, so it is beginning in certain areas. At some point, you're going to have Muslim political parties, and there will be districts, there will be areas where they will have a majority. I think in the UK Parliament at the moment, there are 8 members of Parliament who officially campaigned on what they called on Gaza lists, right? But their main campaign issue was the war in Gaza. Now, whatever you think about the conflict in Gaza, whether it's justified or not, or whether Israel was disproportionate, interesting debates that we can have. But it's very odd to say that you have a local election, or that you have a national election where the local issues would matter. So who is your member of parliament? And that you say, I vote for this guy because he speaks about Gaza all the time. Because there is a growing number of people who identifies more with the issues of the Muslim world than the issues of the country they live in.
Which means there's absolutely no assimilation. They're still
Correct.
They still carry their exact identity and affiliation and loyalty to their original culture and religion, of course. So, okay, so being that that is the case, and anyone can see that, and it's very obvious, okay, this is human nature, and we see it every day. Why would you say the elites, the political elites of Europe, who are essentially orchestrating this, why are they doing this? Because in my mind, there's been something of a shift where, like everyone else, I used to think, oh, they're just stupid, oh, they're lazy, oh, they don't know what they're doing. To now, it's just too hard to dismiss it as ignorance, because it's just, you can't be that ignorant. So it seems to be like by design. Okay, so how do you weigh in on this continuum of, are they just so completely unhinged and intellectually compromised and stupid, or is this part of a global, some kind of project?
I think all of the above. I know that's an unsatisfactory answer. I'm completely aware of this, but I think just to give it maybe the 3 or 4 of the most relevant factors that I see. So one is, I'm sure you've heard of it, probably I just started reading it, so I cannot give a full review, but Gad Saad's new book, right, about suicidal empathy. And I'm not entirely sure if he's, I can mostly judge from what he was saying about this book because I haven't fully read it yet, but he talks about the migration issue and says, okay, this is a case of suicidal empathy. But I'm not entirely sure about this, because what we mentioned, for example, about the city of Vienna a couple of minutes ago is that deep down, the people who are supposedly suffering from suicidal empathy know very well what the consequences of their quote-unquote empathy are, which is why they put their kids in a private school and not in the school where 95% are Arab-speaking. So is it then real empathy, or is it something else?
Is it cowardice and apathy and capitulation?
I think it's that, but I think it's a bit more what the current minister or the minister for, I don't know what the English term would be, for social issues, I guess would be the correct term, or for welfare issues. Bärbel Baas, for our German viewers, said recently when she said, well, she's like her words, not mine, that she's glad that migration takes place because the kind of stultifying, homogeneous German population is something terribly boring and rejectable, and therefore she's glad that the Republic is becoming more colorful and more diverse. And I think that there are people like her who I think is a genuinely stupid person. I don't mean an insult to people who have a mental issue. I think because she also said a couple of weeks ago, there is no migration into the welfare state, which we can talk about the numbers in a second, but 51% of recipients of German, what was called the citizens' money, not yet an unconditional basic income, but very close to it. 51% were non-German passport holders. Of course, there was migration to the welfare system. They should not have called it a citizens' money. They should have called it a non-citizens' money. That would have been more genuine. But I think, despite her stupidity, I believe that she honestly believes that, right? That there is a group of people that genuinely thinks that if we just can delude the Europeans, the Germans, then it's going to be this great
I think most of the people actually fit in that, the majority. But the question is, and I guess this agrees with what you said. You said it's all of the above, which you're right. It's not an either or. I do believe you have a whole continuum, and the majority are ardent believers and fanatics and zealots. In America, we call them the far left. But above that is there a conscious, mind that knows precisely, and what is the end game?
And we can put a number to that. So just to give you one and this is just the federal level. On the federal level, the German government has between 28 and 30 permanent. I don't know what is the word. I guess what you would in the United States call something like the head of the EPA or the head of the Consumer Protection Agency, something like that. And the only field that they work on is discrimination. So you have something about, is there discrimination against gypsies? Is there discrimination against Muslims? So you need, and this is just on the federal level, like it has been impossible. Me and some other journalists tried to find out how many of those exist on the regional level. So, when you do it, it's still work to be completed, but we're probably talking about several hundred. And these are just from the government. So we're not talking about the attached NGO complex that comes with this, which, and the numbers, we're not talking about the occasional 1,000 euros here, 1,000 euros there. We're talking about millions and partially billions that run through these complexes to then a very specific group of people that lives from that. And they need, so to speak, right, they need migration because this is the issue they take care of, just as they need the constant threat and idea that all Germans are racist, right, that all Europeans are racist, that they are xenophobic, they are Islamophobic, they're whatever phobic that you can find because it's their own economic interest. I mean, in a sense, you could say, if you get a university degree in something useless, and I can say political science because I'm a political scientist myself, right? Very often the only viable way to get an income is to join the government NGO complex. And even the term these days, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, NGO is a contradiction in itself. Because if you are financed, I mean, I'm always proposing this to my friends, we need to make a law that says if you get more than 51% of your money from the government, you should legally be barred from calling yourself an NGO because you're not an NGO, you're technically a GO, right? You're a government organization. Yeah. So for them, it's a financial model. And then, of course, the third group, I mean, you dealt a lot in your writings with religious radicalism. And I think, I mean, I'm curious to hear your take on this. I think there is nothing more difficult for a true believer than to admit or to openly say that their beliefs have been contradicted, that their beliefs are wrong. So all these political parties, all these, and I can send you plenty of newspaper articles. A favorite one of mine was in Austria's largest daily newspaper that said in 2015 that 10 years from now, the Europeans will say thank you to Angela Merkel. I mean, this was the headline, right? Because what's going to happen, and another one was, this is the highest skilled migration Europe has ever experienced. Right? This one, and these are people who make their living from being experts on this issue, and they have been as wrong as you can be. So for them to come out now and say, you know what I said 10 years ago was utter rubbish and completely wrong, they can't say it. So what do? One, they double down, right? They say, oh, this is all not true. Or they say, well, we would have been right, but it's just because the Germans, the Austrians, the French...
They're still so racist.
Exactly, right? So they're racist. So this is the reason why, why the Afghan goatherd is not yet a neurosurgeon. It's not because there might be a skill gap. No, it's because these Austrian doctors are so racist. And kind of the next argument now we hear is always that without these people, the economic system would collapse. Which is odd because it didn't collapse before 2015. And if you think about it, just to give a concrete number, I think that there's approximately around 1 million Syrians in Germany. And if I'll fact check it, but it should be more or less about 4% of the Syrian population lives in Germany. I think that the remittances alone that they sent back, right, are a major boon to the Syrian economy, which is what the Syrian president openly says, we're not going to take those people back.
Yeah, they're a source of income.
They're a source of income, right? And the question then is again, shouldn't there be a law? I mean, I'm very surprised that the government can simply say, oh no, we're not going to take those people back. Right?
So they're just pure ideologues living in a utopian bubble who are convinced that as long as we keep, following these sort of leftist, the extreme, naive policies, it's going to work. And if it doesn't, it's because everyone's still incorrigibly racist. That's the default.
Well, it's that, and I think there's a certain, how to put this, I think there's a certain arrogance to it as well, because there are laudable exceptions like yourself. I mean, you've written for this for very long, and I think you've been on the forefront of this much quicker than others. But in the continental Europe, or the continental European case, the only voices who did say that, guys, this is not going to work out, right? There was this quote-unquote far-right parties. It was members of the working class. It was the non-educated, right? The uncouth masses, right? So it was all the people that those who sit in university chairs or in the media and culture said, oh, you don't have to, they don't know anything.
What do they know? Yeah.
Exactly.
Peasants.
Precisely, the peasants, the hoi polloi, the let them eat cake kind of crowd. And it turns out that they were right. And I think this paints, in my estimate, I think this paints them more than anything. Right? It's kind of, you know, it's like in these comedies when you are the theoretical physicist and you stand on the wall table and you try to figure. I think it's a Good Will Hunting. I think there's such a scene. You know, you try to crack this mathematical problem, and then the janitor comes in and takes a look and says, "Oh, this is the solution." And it is in a sense the same thing, right? You hold these sociologists who did their studies and their polls and said, "Oh, this is all going to work out," as you said, in an utopian fashion. And you had, you know, the cleaning lady, so to speak, or the guy from the street who said, "Nah, I don't see that working out." And they turn out to be right, and the others turned out to be wrong. And I think this is the thing that they really cannot abide.
Okay, so moving forward, what needs to happen for the commonsensical hoi polloi Europeans to reclaim their, you know, nations? We look at countries like Britain, and I mean, things there are getting pretty extreme and very polarized. And I imagine that sort of thing will be visiting other nations as well. The thing about Germany, I have to say this before we proceed, is because I spoke with a German fellow the other day, and he basically confessed that there's just something about Germans, especially because after World War II, they've been so sort of demoralized and almost indoctrinated and just loathing everything about their history. Because apparently their entire history begins and ends with Hitler. That's how it has to be taught. There's nothing else, apparently.
The only German chancellor with a migration background?
Yeah. And so according to him, he was basically saying, yeah, it's over for us. We don't have the fortitude or the willpower to stand up because we've been stripped of it, and we're so full of guilt that so what you're saying works with them. If you say, oh, this didn't work because you're racist, they internalize that, and then they want to so hard make sure that it doesn't seem that way. So that itself, I wouldn't call it suicidal empathy, but I just call it suicidal.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so with that German paradigm in the background, what do you think is going on with Western Europe in general moving forward?
I think that's a great point, and I agree with it. The only counter question, maybe I have time to get to this, that I would have then is, okay, but why has this weird German obsession also infected so many other Western countries, and even going beyond this, right? I mean, you have similar debates in Australia, you have them in the UK, you have them in the United States. I mean, I'm always surprised, because I would go, if we want to be facetious and a little bit provocative, I would say there is a sense that all of Western history appears to have started and ended with Hitler. I mean, you have no other comparison where all over the globe people constantly refer to a figure from German history. Like there is no comparable figure from any other country's history where it's done it the same way. So nobody in Germany stands up and says, "Oh my God, you sound like Thomas Jefferson," right? Or you are a veritable Benedict Arnold.
No Mongol feels guilty because someone called him Genghis Khan. Actually, they're proud of it.
I was just about to say, right?
Isn't that interesting?
I think that's absolutely right.
Even though realistically, I think he's much worse actually than all of these European statesmen and what they did. Pyramids of skulls everywhere. Yeah. It's pretty horrific. So yeah, I would agree with you that in general, it's more of a white European kind of guilt epitomized by Germany. That's the pinnacle, I think we can say, what's happening there. And you're right, a lot of it has to do, this has been kind of my field of work, what I deal with is just all this, what I call fake history, where you make history look like every horrible, atrocious thing that's ever happened in the world's always by Europeans, whites, Christians. And everyone else is, just a victim. And then you look at history and it's oftentimes the exact opposite. Okay, so it's, and that's one of the reasons why, to go back to what I was saying, is why I feel like this is intentional. I've grabbed history books and read them, written by modern day historians, and literally it says the exact opposite. One well-known professor, John Esposito, Georgetown University, he writes about the Muslim world and the Christian world. He says that it was nothing but peace until the First Crusade. That's where the problem started, and there was no reason for the First Crusade. He doesn't tell you that for those centuries of peace, Muslims were conquering and annexing 3/4 of the Christian world and destroying churches, burning thousands of them. He doesn't say that. So that is definitely one of the reasons why people are so compromised when they come to these questions. But so what do you think, what is a solution? What needs to be done? I
mean, I come to that in a second, but since you mentioned Georgetown University, I mean, I think that's a beautiful example where I think they have the Bridge Initiative, where they have an Austrian fellow, Farid Hafez, who publishes like the yearly Islamophobia report, and he recently tries to, I think, drag somebody through court where he then ultimately lost. And as far as, again, this is what the reporting says. I don't want to get anybody into legal trouble, but that they get funding from Qatar, if I'm not mistaken, is correct. But also that apparently they have some editorial, let's say, influence on what is being published. So as I think you are right. I think there are...
Georgetown, when I was there, it was a well-known fact. It was getting like 20 million from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, that, yeah. So precisely. So this is that there is exactly as you say there, and I think we're going to come to this. There's, if in the culture war, right, you basically preemptively capitulate, then somebody else is going to fill the vacuum. Yeah. And I think that the richer parts of the Muslim world have done a very good job. And by the way, I don't blame them for this. I think that's a almost brilliant PR strategy. They did a really, really good job. And
they're thinking about their welfare.
Exactly.
They're being normal, healthy people.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely.
You can't blame them for that.
No.
Just like when people get upset because, they're having so many children, they're procreating. Well, I mean, I don't blame that. That's a good thing. That's a healthy sign.
I think that's absolutely correct. And the kind of the thing that gives me a bit of hope might be an exaggeration at this point, but I tend to say it's 5 minutes to 12, but not yet 5 minutes past 12. So this is the level of optimism that I'm still having. But it's kind of funny. I saw this just by coincidence when I took the train from Vienna to Budapest. There is an article that now apparently is making the rounds by Tony Blair and the Tony Blair Institute. And there are like two things. One is not related to our issue, but the second one is. But I just found the first one also funny, where he says, well, Labour have to completely redefine themselves. That they need to do a 180 degree. And one point is they have to shift from clean energy to cheap energy, which I just found funny because this is what the quote-unquote far right has been saying for 30 years. But the second point that makes in this, it's an X article, so it's X very well. So I can just everyone just go on if you want to, but otherwise you're going to hear Ibrahim and myself, Raymond, talking about it. You can find the article where it says, like when it comes to migration, the precise terminology is that everything human possible has to be done to stop illegal migration. So this is precisely the kind of wording that Reform and Restore and the AfD again have been using for as long as these parties have existed. Now in Austria, the right-wing party goes back to the 60s and 70s. The AfD is around 20 years old, but this is the language they used. And everybody said, oh my God, this is fascism and crypto-Nazism. And now you have Tony Blair, right, of all people, saying, man, we have to do what's humanly possible, like to stop mass migration. I said, well, welcome to the club, Tony. We've been saying this for a very, very, very long time. So there is this gradual shift, like an ocean liner, right, that wants to make a 180-degree turn, that more and more people, I think, slowly and gradually kind of see, okay, this, as we said before, is not going to work. And by the way, where I think people are moving much quicker is the general population. I mean, there is, despite working against the media and also being split up, right, in the UK now, Restore and Reform, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing can be debated. You have the Freedom Party in Austria, you have the AfD, you have Le Pen, you have all these different political parties that are, with few exceptions, everywhere where there is polling, they're everywhere in the lead. And if you ask people what's the reason, well, it's the economy, no doubt about this, but it is also very often as a second or third or first topic, it is migration. I mean, and if you look on which issues these successful politicians, Meloni in Italy, for example, but even Donald Trump in 2016, what did they campaign on? The main issue was migration. Yeah. I know with Trump it got a bit diluted for all kinds of reasons and very understandably. But the moment when his campaign really got traction was when he came down the elevator and he made his by now famous, I guess back then infamous speech about they don't send us their best people, they send thieves and rapists. Yeah. This was when everybody said, he's done. He's toast. If you speak like this about the migrant community, it's over.
And everyone loved him.
And everyone loved him because everybody said, you know what? And because everybody knows that, of course, he doesn't mean everyone. But this is always this debate but they're also rapists who are Austrian. Yes, but that doesn't mean you bring additional ones from somewhere else.
Well, so now that you mentioned that, and of course, I'm sure there are rapists in Austria, but relative to their numbers versus relative to the rapists who are migrant background, I imagine it's just completely skewed.
It is skewed, and even if, because there's always the argument, or for example, I think in Germany, Algerians are 16 times more likely to be involved in crimes of a sexual nature than anybody else. I say, well, it's because of the age, it's socioeconomic factors, it's demography. But
it doesn't matter. The point is they're 16
times. The point is that's the one, and even if you control for all these factors, they are still 4 to 5 times more likely. So there is something in the culture. Again, it's not, to be very clear, it's not in the blood, it's not in the genes, but it is in the culture. And when people say, okay, fine, then over time they will integrate, assimilate, and they will adapt. How can they, if, as I told you before, like in Vienna, if 95% of a school class are Arab Muslims, how exactly will they integrate with the remaining 5%? It's the other way around. We have stories of schoolgirls, non-Muslim schoolgirls, who are now starting to veil themselves because that's the only way for them to be left alone. We know that during Ramadan, we have teachers who say, basically, these are teachers saying this, you can basically close down the schools during Ramadan. Because they don't eat, they don't drink, even though you're the expert on this, correct me if I'm wrong, I think technically if you're doing hard labor, even in the Quran it says you're allowed to, I think at least you're allowed to drink something.
Dispensations.
Also, yeah, so they say basically you can close down the schools because the children cannot study, they're incapable of doing so. So you have 95%, 48%, and those kids who are not Muslim, they get shunned and they basically get forced into keeping up with Ramadan as well, because of course those 5 guys who are fasting, so the one guy with his bacon and pork sandwich, that this is not going to happen.
Are the Austrians, since we're talking about Vienna again, and other Europeans in general, I mean, I know some more than others, but let's say the Austrians, when I hear this, and I've read stories about the mothers in Vienna where they go pick up their child and he's sitting there screaming Allahu Akbar because they're teaching him that, and he's engaged in prayers and he's involved in Ramadan fasting, like you said. And I mean, do the parents, and I find that ironic because in Austria and in Europe in general, the people whose background is Christian heritage, they're always told, no, you keep that to yourself. Do they find it ironic that a foreign religion is now being forced down their throat? And do they care?
Well, I think they would have found it ironic if it would have been the occasional anecdote. But since now it's more or less becoming average, especially in the urban areas, it causes frustration. I think there's a reason why the right-wing party is polling almost at 40%. I mean, this is the main issue, and justifiably so. But what I have to say as somebody who considered himself to be on the right for quite a long time, especially in the urban areas, the countryside is still better, but the velocity and the speed of this transformation, I think it surprised everyone. So even the utopian, optimists, sort of a little bit in their defense, the idea was always that if we would have had this conversation 10 years ago, people would have said Raymond and Ralph are nuts.
Yeah, of course.
Right? I mean, this is not going to, this is alarmist, this is the fear-mongering, this is never going to happen. And it did happen, or it is happening as we speak, much, much quicker than one would have imagined. But once again, as we said before, you see similar things happening, in different areas, on a different scale, but you see partially in the United States as well, right? Welfare fraud in Ohio, welfare fraud in Minnesota, where you have kind of these, because this is the thing, is I have no problem with Islam in the Muslim world, but there is something, I'm sure there are exceptions to this. So Turkey might be an exception, but again, I'm not you are the expert on this region, so you know this better than I do. But of course, if people come from a culture that is much more tribal and clannish, they bring this tribal and clannishness then also into their new countries. And we are not built for tribal Islam and clannishism, if that's not a word, I know, but you know what I mean.
It's accurate.
What you then see, because people say, okay, fine, so what's the big deal? Why should we care? Well, we should care because, to give again a concrete example, you then have the situation as it was with the so-called grooming gangs, which is, in my opinion, a euphemism for rape gangs, that then all of a sudden, like it happened in some of these, it was in Rotherham and other parts of the country, where you then have police officers participating, not just not reporting or concealing, but participating in those crimes. Because even for them, if they have a specific background, right? For them, their tribal or clan membership, if you want, is more important than the badge they're wearing or the loyalty to the state. Right. So we import something that supposedly we in the West have overcome. And to be very clear, if other parts of the world want to be arranged along tribal structures, the House of Saud, or whoever the ruling family of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates is, and That's all fine by me, but I don't want it here. Yeah. And this then always drives me crazy when you hear, oh, if only the entire Muslim world would become like the United Arab Emirates. I mean, technically, if you look at or Qatar, if you look at these countries, it's more or less, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's, a family, a handful of families who rules over 80% of a migrant worker population. Yeah. These are not countries in the way that...
They're not exemplars in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, exactly. Like it might work in that very specific case.
Because it's such a tiny sample.
Exactly, yeah. But the idea that the entire Middle East will become one large United Arab Emirates, I mean, this is just complete madness.
Just to kind of like re-articulate what you're saying, because I think this is one of the most important aspects. It's what's going on is Western societies are very high trust, ethical societies. Okay, of course, there's bad people within them. But then you bring Muslims who are, like you were saying, tribalistic and exploitative, because the whole concept of tribalism is one tribe exploits and attacks the other tribe. That's the whole point. That's how you actually prosper in life. Okay, so you send that demographic into this high trust society who's expecting everyone to reciprocate in the same way, and what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah,
it's exactly what we're seeing. And I guess a lot of that, and this is, brings up another important question, is because to me, this goes back to Europe's Christian roots. That's why Europe is the way it is and why it is a high trust society, though I think most people, including most Europeans, don't make this connection. And they think that the society they have today is just the natural culmination of a secular, enlightened thinking, which it's not. And and this is, again, why I sometimes go back to the idea that a lot of this is intentional, because it's like an insidious attack on a Christian tradition and Christian mores.
Yes. I think that's true. The only thing I would add is that this attack, I think, goes further back in time than many people are willing to admit. I would argue there are some good parts of it, but there are also some darker parts of it. I think this goes back to the Enlightenment. I mean, this idea, even what you hear now, I always find it interesting, I think you do as well, right? The things that trickle down into common culture, right? When people speak about something as if they know about it, when reality is completely different. So give a concrete example. Everybody likes to talk about the Spanish Inquisition and, and how terrible, how horrible, and Monty Python and whatnot. But I think if you look at the numbers, I guess the French Revolution killed more people in a year than the whole Spanish Inquisition killed in 3.5 centuries. Yeah. But when you how many witches were burned, and it's a million. Then you've got the actual number. It's much smaller. Yeah, I mean, every single one is terrible, but it's like it was like a kind of genocide that took place. What you mentioned about the Crusades, right? There's still this idea that this was this unprovoked, out of nowhere, like these crusaders,
racist Europeans who wanted to go hurt Arabs.
Yeah, exactly. So this is such a, but this is when you talk to people about this and you say, right, this is the interesting. Very often they are not resisting this new information. It's just that they say, "Oh, I never heard that." Right? I never. And as you said, it's intentional. But I think it's intentional not because it's some Jewish conspiracy or something. I think it's intentional because they started with Voltaire, right? They started with the French Enlightenment. Where they said we need to.
I do think it goes way back.
Yeah, we need to eradicate the church and Christianity and everything that comes with it. And this is still with us. As I said, and I'm not saying reverse the Enlightenment. There's a lot of stuff I like, but I think we have to be honest enough to say, no, put it this way, fine. If you want to get rid of Christianity, fair enough. Not my choice, but sure. But then you need to replace it with something. So we don't try it.
Secular humanism.
Yeah, sure.
Isn't that working great?
Well, okay, fine. The name. What's the football team of secular humanism, right? So who is willing to kill and die for secular humanism?
No one. That's why the West is dying. Yeah. Because Muslims are willing to die for their thing.
Or who's willing to have children? I mean, secular humanism actually, if you, at least in its extreme forms, tells you shouldn't have children in the first place. Yeah, exactly. Because overpopulation is the major problem.
And it's such a horrible world. Why bring a child into?
Yeah, exactly. And the carbon footprint of a baby is like just too nightmarish. I mean, and this, I think you hit the nail on the head. We talked about this in a previous conversation. The very famous Osama bin Laden quote, which I'm sure sounds even better in Arabic, that if people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they prefer by nature the strong horse. Yeah. And Islam is strong, at least to a certain extent, because we are weak. And this is, you cannot beat something with nothing. And what I said. What does it mean to be English, to be European? I mean, we live in a period, and this is an anecdote that seems absurd, but I think it exemplifies so much. This happened about half a year ago. No, I think not even. So a very recent example, where they had on one of these British schools said at Culture Day. And I don't know how many Spice Girl fans are among your viewers, but I remember like 30, my God, 30 years ago. So when the Spice Girls were having their 15 minutes of fame, I think it was Gary Halliwell who was wearing like this very tight dress in that had a Union Jack on it, right? And I think it looked actually pretty good. And I actually I still do like the Spice Girls, full disclosure. And there was this 11-year-old girl who said, it's Culture Day. This is the United Kingdom, and she thought it would be a fun and nice idea to wear. I think it was not as revealing as the one that Gary Halliwell was wearing, but it was a dress with the Union Jack on it. And this girl was sent home. And she said, again, an 11-year-old girl, she said she doesn't understand. So she said, why is everybody allowed to celebrate their culture, but I'm not allowed to celebrate mine in my own country? And this attitude, right, exactly as you said before, that's the suicidal attitude. But that's not suicidal empathy. That's suicidal self-hatred.
Yes.
I think those are two completely different things.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. And what's even stranger about that is and for some reason Britain has the worst of these stories.
Oh yeah, always.
Yeah,
you always have to double check them because you read
they're not. It's like parodies. They're not real.
That can't be.
Yeah,
exactly,
and then they're real, which itself is just kind of mind-boggling. But the other thing, here's the thing that these people, you were talking about this politician saying, yes, homogeneity is so boring, let's change it. How could if you get out of the European white population of the world, which I know is under 10%. The entire world, maybe it's like 8, I think, maybe like Caucasian white, and you look at the entire world, which is black, brown, yellow, okay, vast majority, their countries, they celebrate their heritage, it's their way or the highway, their religion, not just Islam, all of them, okay, and that's not bad, that's normal. I'm saying they're normal. And then you come to this little tiny percentage, these white people, and they're the ones who, from the moment they're born, are just pounded in the head. You have to give up everything. You have to suppress your religion. You have to accommodate everyone. You're a horrible person. Yeah. And they're the minority. This is the irony, because, we live in this society where the minority has to be protected. Well, you actually are the minority, and you're the ones who are going out of your way to do and accommodate everyone, and they're the majority, and they would never, ever, ever do this for you. So that's why exactly, this isn't empathy. This is madness and just pure suicide.
Well, let me add on something to this. This probably sounds boring, but what's wrong with boring? Well, I'm sure that Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution was everything but boring. But would the same with the French Revolution? It's always, in hindsight, one says, I want to live during these exciting times. But once I think it's this supposed Chinese curse, right? May you live in interesting times. And I don't know if this is true or not, but if you actually end up in these interesting times, honestly, if I look back the 1990s, seem pretty mellow, I guess is the saying, in a good way. So this idea that, oh my God, if there is more conflict, more violence, and civil war-like conditions, wouldn't that be more like? It surely is more diverse. I grant you that, but is this really something where you want to raise a family, where you want to have children? Well,
you're not supposed to do that anyway, remember? Because the carbon footprint.
But I think, indeed. But I think you're absolutely right, and this is, I think, what Gazzard, at least in the European case, I think at least partially gets wrong, is that this has always been and this is mostly to be seen on the left. They don't care about the migrant, right? The migrant is a tool, a means to an end. Exactly. How do you show that? What's the best way to show that you're not a nationalist? By embracing and elevating every nation except your own. Yeah. And this is what they're doing. But this is not because the Canadian author Mark Stein said this years ago. He says, whenever you talk to the quote-unquote multiculturalists, they don't know anything about other cultures. The so-called horrible, terrible, no-good imperial Europeans, and there was a lot of stuff that was not great, I'm the first one to admit it, but one thing you cannot blame them, which is that they were not curious, right? They went and they saw the hieroglyphs and said, oh, what could this mean? And they went digging around and they tried to learn obscure languages, and they went to all these places and tried, in many cases, again, this might sound borderline racist, but I think it is true that Europeans were more interested in foreign cultures than those cultures were in themselves.
Well, above and on top of that is the very fact that colonialism, which is so attacked as the most horrible thing and only white man's done it. If you look at it, and whatever the bad things Europeans did, they actually brought good stuff with them. Okay, they brought technology, medicine, literature, progress.
You can say this because your last name is Ibrahim.
Exactly, I can get away with this. But when the Muslims and other non-Europeans attacked other people, including Europeans, they just literally brought death and destruction and enslavement. And we know this, we have the records. What did the Ottoman Empire do when it entered into Europe? Or what did the Moors do when they entered into Spain? And by the way, the Golden Age thing, that's its own topic. It's another part of the fake history. But so there's the progress. That's what I mean. And who's the most person blamed, or the most race blamed for racism? Whites. But who's the one that abolished it?
Yeah, no.
It's just, I just find it very ironic and selective.
But you're so right. And it also shows precisely what you've been pointing at. It's also the use of history and language. I mean, another example is the Germans have been in Germany longer than the Maori have been in New Zealand. Yet the Maori are indigenous people and the Germans are not.
That's interesting,
It's so weird. There was this, I think it was at Financial Times, there is some tribe in Finland or somewhere, and it says, it's the only indigenous people in Europe. Where I said, what's that supposed to mean?
Yeah.
So this is very, you cannot even say that Austrians or French or the Angles, whatever, the Anglos are indigenous to the land, because then, that is the thing, because then you would, I guess that's the modern lingo, then you would give them privilege, right? Because
they belong there.
Exactly, because then all of a sudden you can say as an English person or as a German person, we want to keep Germany German, or English, or England English, because this is our native land. So I mean, this is the odd thing. Not you, but some, right? It's almost an attempt to eradicate the history of peoples that have some form of continuous history over centuries, if not millennia. I think.
And at the same time, artificially introduce, for example, maybe you know about, it's called the Quran EU project.
I heard about it, but yeah, elaborate a bit on it.
Which is basically, it's like, I don't know how many millions of euros the EU is putting into it, but it's a whole project, basically, when reading between the lines, as I have, to convince Europeans that the Quran and Islam in general have been part of the fabric of Europe, no less than Christianity. Okay, and the reasons they give are absurd, because I actually know what they're talking about. So they'll say, oh, look, as early as, let's say, the 9th century, this Spaniard translated the Quran. And what they're not telling you, though, is he was doing it in the context of warfare against Islam, and the whole thing, he was just talking about how horrible this book is, and what a monstrosity, what a perverse doctrine, a false prophet. That's actually what it was, but they twist it around. They do this too with Thomas Jefferson. He had a Quran, and they always say, oh, look how progressive and enlightened he was. Actually, that was because he was learning about the Barbary Wars that he was involved with, which is Muslim. So not only are they essentially trying to convince the indigenous Europeans that you don't have any rights here, but they artificially claim that the invaders or the foreigners do have it.
I think that's a great point. And it was a fantasy TV show from a couple of years ago called Sleepy Hollow. It's still on Disney Plus for those who still are subscribed to it. And
which one? I'm a fan. You're talking about the Disney?
Yeah, the
cartoon.
The cartoon, they have to, like, it's called Sleepy Hollow, and it's a fantasy, scary. It's actually kind of well made, so I did enjoy it. But there's this one scene, because as you said also before, I always find it interesting how wrong history is integrated into pop culture. And so they had this conversation with some Cherokee or something, and then there's again this guy said, oh my God, but the Cherokee, they were the main influence when we wrote the American Constitution, which is but it's the same with you said. So you have this one project that says that actually European culture is basically just the offshoot of Muslim culture. But you also have these movements in the United States, or at least sometimes this history that says, well, actually, Thomas Jefferson and all these other people that contributed to the Constitution, that they actually they looked it up from the Cherokee and said, oh, we want to run these societies like the Indians ran theirs, which is this constant desire to disown your own culture.
Well, is there a worse example than pop culture movies where every historical character who historically was European is now black?
It is, yeah.
I guess this new, Troy, the Trojan War, and Helen, the face that cast 1,000 ships, is this it's a black woman, which is not for the first time. I mean, this is every time you see a movie, they've shown Vikings who are black. And they're trying to imply like that's normal. Because if you go back in time, half the Vikings were all black. Well,
Cleopatra. right?
Well, they've been doing that for the longest time
because
she's Egyptian. Yeah. She's not. She's Greek. And Egypt, of course, is black, as you can see. So yeah, they've been doing that for a long time. But so my point is, it's not even just books and history. Pop culture is the worst example of literally appropriating and erasing people of history and literature and just putting different races. And it's like, why?
But this is, I think...
And it makes people more, sometimes I wonder, are they doing this to make people resentful? Because that is the net result. People get angry. Are they doing this to anger whites against blacks? Well, it's kind of a...
Well, I think it is, but it's also the idea, I guess, was that you burn down the village and then you build something new on the ruins. But what they underestimated is that somebody else is now coming in and building something new in the ruins. Right. Because the promise this is why I slightly exaggerate, but this is why I see the commonality with the Enlightenment. Right? The idea was, well, if we get rid of Christianity, if we get rid of all that superstition, then we'll be truly free. And then you had in the 60s, right, you had this idea coming up, well, if we can get rid of patriotism, of nationalism.
But if it was getting rid of religion, here's what I don't get.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, that's how it seems, but then why are you okay with Islam? If Christianity is just a religion and a superstition and you want to get rid of it, you want to be enlightened, why are you kowtowing to something that's even more superstitious and unenlightened?
This is the thing. I'm not so sure if they are, at least some of them, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's, but somebody, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but this was always the argument of Christopher Hitchens, right? Well,
he was anti-Islam very much.
But he always argued with those who were warning, like the conversation that we're having now. His argument was, at least in a review that he did, I think, of Mark Stein's book of America Alone, which came out in 2005, he made the argument that the seductive powers of like the secularization and the kind of hedonistic lifestyle of the Europeans is so seductive that they will not be able to resist it. And I just went back to it. Somebody else wrote it also a couple of years ago. This was the idea. Right? There's this, as you also said before, like this idea that, or as Francis Fukuyama writes about in The Origins of Political Order, this idea of getting to Denmark, that we are all on the same train tracks. It's just that some of us are on a train that's a little further behind, but the stops are all the same. So if you come to Europe or the United States, within 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, you'd be just as American or as European as somebody who stepped off the Mayflower or whose ancestors, fought the Romans in the Teutoburger
So maybe
Forest.
They thought Muslims would come, and after 1 generation, they'd just get rid of their Islam and become just secularists and materialists.
And I guess if it would have been a small number, that would have been true. Yeah. But even there, and this is so important, I'm so glad that you bring this up. Even if we look at the history of migration to the United States, I mean, it's a complete myth. I mean, ultimately it worked out, but under great pains, that the Irish, the Italians, and other, let's say, more problematic migrant groups were fully assimilated and integrated. And by the way, again, something that is often completely forgotten, many of them did leave. Like there was, for example, a wave of Italian immigration. There was also a wave of Italian emigration, because in the United States you had to assimilate because otherwise you starved. But there is a great book by somebody who's not on the right, whose name is Garrett Jones. I wrote this great book, The Culture Transplant. And he's not the man on the right. And it's basically a book on all the major studies that have been done about migration and how quickly groups actually assimilate. And at least that's his conclusion. Again, not a right wing. I think he's a professor of economics at George Mason University. He says that the subtitles is even... I'm paraphrasing, but it's along the lines of why migrants turn their countries, they move into countries that are like their own. So
I'm familiar with that.
I'm sure you've seen it. It made the rounds a little bit, and it's more or less basically it just looks at the numbers, and it says that what we know with quite some certainty as that, because you mentioned high trust and these things and social capital. He says that if people come from low trust and low social capital societies, they bring it with them and it sticks around for at least 2 to 3 generations. So as I said, if you bring a small number in, right, I guess you can manage it. But again, going back to the city of Vienna, when you say 48% in middle schools or public middle schools, that's the next generation. Like this is going to be very, very difficult to dilute. Right? So, and this is... Unless this reality is being accepted and faced, to be honest, I don't know what to do. You probably have to do something like busing, like they did in the United States during towards the end of segregation. They say, okay, you just take these children and move them around from school to school. But I'm not sure if that's going to solve the problem.
Okay, Ralph. So a lot of dismal information here, and not looking good. And we don't have to end it on a high note. I seldom do. I just want to end it on an honest note. So what's needed? What do you think can even realistically happen at this point, or is the West doomed?
Well, in my opinion, there are two scenarios. Well, actually, there are three scenarios. Like one is the one I told you when I mentioned Tony Blair, a person I'm not a huge fan of. So either even old establishment figures and old establishment parties see the writing on the wall and change course.
How about just complete capitulation? I can almost see Germans doing that.
Well, not in the countryside, right? So a lot of the phenomena we talk about is concentrated in urban areas. So that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, which I think at the moment is the most likely one, that new movements will win elections and then can create the change that is necessary. And option number three, which is the one that I most dread, I think it's going to happen in some countries, hopefully not everywhere, but that's civil strife and localized civil war.
Which would be pretty dismal. All right. Okay, Ralph, thanks a lot.
Raymond, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we'll do it again. I'm going to bring on Ralph Schoellhammer, and you may have actually seen me with him just yesterday. I think I mentioned this. Coincidentally, we actually did a video talking about these very topics, I think a couple of weeks ago, and it came out yesterday, coincidentally, and now he's gracious enough to come on right now, and I'm going to ask him, because he knows a lot. He's European. He's from Vienna. He's covered these topics very closely, so let me bring him on and see what he has to say. Hi, Ralph. How's it going?
Hey, Ibrahim. Good to talk to you. It's you who is gracious to have me on your show. I really appreciate it.
No, it's my honor. I'm glad to hear it. Okay. So what's the deal? What do you think of this report? What's going on? What are your thoughts? I mean, obviously, there's so much to flesh out and talk about this report. I'm trying to remove this. Oh, here we go. Okay. So yeah, let's have at it. Share your mind with us.
You're Raymond, you are a Coptic Christian, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
So let's do a quick thought experiment. Let's just let's try to kind of steelman the Rupert Lowe, the rape gang inquiry report. So there's a lot of debates whether the 250,000 is too high, whether it's too low. But let's take one number we know, right? We know that there have been 1,400 victims in Rotherham. Now imagine for a second in Pakistan or in Egypt, there would be an investigation that shows that Coptic Christians have gang raped and tortured 1,400 Muslim girls. We all know what would happen to the churches and the Christian community in this.
Oh my God.
We all know what would happen. I just really want to point this out, because we always hear, the West is so racist and so Islamophobic and so terrible. But the immediate reaction you had in the West, at least in some parts.
Wait. Since you made this analogy, I'm now going to have to tell people what would happen. Okay.
Well, go on.
Because I actually know, because I know exactly what would happen. So already, okay. So what you're basically saying is it's a good analogy. The Coptic Christians are a minority in Egypt. They're the indigenous people. Okay. They were there before the Muslims conquered them. They're about, let's say, 10%. I think Muslims are something like 10% in Britain. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is, let's imagine if the cops all of a sudden came out, they were grooming and raping Muslim girls, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Here's all I have to tell you, that if it's even, because according to Islamic law, a Muslim man can go out with Christians, Jews, because they're infidels and because they're women, and women are already second class. So it doesn't matter if they're infidels, they have no authority. But a Christian cannot, or a non-Muslim cannot go out with cannot marry a Muslim girl. Now, frequently in Egypt, you will hear a rumor that a Coptic or Christian man was dating a Muslim girl, just dating, and that they both like each other. Muslims will rise up and burn down every single Christian home and church based on that. So now that's what would happen if there's like a consensual dating, not rape, between one of those Christians and one of those Muslims. And you're basically saying, well, what would happen if actually they found out for 50 years or way more, actually, the cops were systematically raping and torturing Muslim girls? There would be a genocide in one day, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of this story, because we have to ask the question. I mean, I don't want to formulate it too provocatively, but whether and we talked about this in our previous conversation as well, or at least we alluded to it, whether our self-perceived degree of civilization, if you want, is not also a form of a weakness. Now, it's almost midnight here in Austria, so forgive me, and your audience, forgive me if I don't formulate my thoughts as clearly as I want to. But you know what I mean. I think that it's some people in the comments, where have all the real men gone? And I'm not sure it's like necessarily a man issue, but it's very odd that we haven't even talked that much in the public debate. Wasn't even that much about the perpetrators. It immediately was about, well, maybe it hasn't been 250,000, maybe it was only 25,000. And I think this is where our thought experiment comes in quite illuminating, to say in any other country, if it would be 1,000, all hell would break loose. And in the UK, the debate is, well, it might be, because the thing is also, by the way, that it might be less than 250,000, but it might also be more than 250,000, because the British government refused to keep accurate records about this. So maybe one wants to err on the side of a lower number, but it is just as possible that the number is slightly higher. So this truly is, and this has been going on. Just, I know you have talked about this on your show already, but just to really emphasize this again, this has been going on for 13 years. And more or less nobody talked about it. I mean, it really beggars belief what has happened there.
This is an old tactic too, which I see, and basically what you're saying is they it's like a smoke screen. They start nitpicking at the number as if that's what the issue is. Oh, it's not 250, it's only whatever, it's only 150. It doesn't matter, man. It's and this is the Muslim example I gave you with the Egyptian and the Copts. I mean, there were other instances in Egypt where, get this, Coptic women, were supposedly, because this happens often, Muslims will abduct Coptic women and forcibly convert them, just like in Pakistan, identical. And they'd, you see, it's like 1 week earlier, the Coptic woman was with her husband and children. There's pictures of her happy, and then a week later, she makes a video wearing a hijab. And she's like, yes, I've converted to Islam of my own free will. And I'm and everyone knows she was kidnapped and abducted. Okay. So this happened. And finally, at one point, the Coptic church managed to get one of these women back. Okay. And the Muslims rioted, burned like 15 churches. Okay. Because the Christians reclaimed one of their own. And the Muslims presented it as, look, she's a true Muslim and they're taking her against her will. How can we stand for this? So that was one woman, all right? Her name was Camilla. So whether it's 250,000 girls or probably 500,000 or 100,000, yeah, it's completely irrelevant. But that's the game they like to play, get you. It reminds me of what happened to Henry Nowak, which is kind of like the argument became, the bad thing isn't that the police were more concerned that he might have said a word, not that he was stabbed. The bad thing was that the guy lied. He didn't say the word. It doesn't matter. Actually, they're both bad, because even if he had said the word, a word is not as bad as stabbing someone, right?
I mean, I don't know how many of your viewers and listeners have followed. There was a story that came out of Scotland it was almost a couple of months ago, and lots of memes and pictures were going around. It was a little girl defending her sister from being approached by
I remember that. Yeah, but tell us about it.
Yeah, right. Where she was brandishing, I think, a knife and a small axe. I mean, I don't know why she had anyways, and. So the story then very quickly moved in the direction, well, this was all made up, right? That actually that the girls were the threat, and Unheard and a couple of media outlets that I usually have a very high opinion of, right? Immediately they went on Twitter, The Spectator, right? Everybody went out and said, "Oh, this is the meme, that was the meme fantasy of the right?" Kind of this idea that there's something has been imagined that didn't really happen. Now we have the actual court decision, and it happened precisely the way as the girls told the story from the beginning, right? They were approached in an inappropriate sexual manner by, in this case, again, two people from Bulgaria. So, it doesn't always have to be from the Middle East. It doesn't always have to be Islam. But again, the immediate reaction was that the native Scottish girls, they must be lying, or they must make something up, or the online right that jumped to their defense, they must be, making stuff up, and all the highbrow, posh journalists. They knew it better, and now there was some begrudging admittance that, well, it turned out that actually the original reporting was right. That, don't get me wrong, the mistakes happen on both sides, but this this reflex, this knee-jerk reaction to immediately take the side of the foreigner or the perpetrator and not the native population and the victim. It is very, very odd. I mean, we had these cases, we talked a lot on your podcast about Germany, but we really had debates, for example, after the famous, I'm sure that many of your viewers have heard it, the New Year's night in Cologne, I think it was in 2017, 2018.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah. And again, once the dust has settled, the pretty much all the worst expectations were proven to be correct. You had the police reports and all of you had the complaints, you had the women who filed reports, but then you still had newspaper articles that said, well, maybe women who don't like foreigners were making those stories up. So it is very odd. And as I always say, that the point is not to generalize, the point is not to demonize, but it is equally important to say that there are certain problems that you have been writing about for a very long time, that some on the political right have been warning for almost 30 years. I mean, I give you a concrete example. What am I saying? 30 years. Enoch Powell basically issued his first warning in 1968. That's almost 60 years ago. Now, he probably got the details wrong, but I think the broad outline was correct. Then a work of fiction, but I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with, is Schoellhammer Special I, right? The Camp of the Saints. It's fiction, but I think it was written in 75, 76, thereabouts. But in many ways, it predicted particularly the behavior of the elites. This is, for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a harrowing
and it was
read.
banned. It was so banned you could never find this book until I heard recently. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the point is both in the realm of, and then of course you had submission by my French is very bad, by Monsieur Houellebecq, or however you pronounce him. We probably have to write it in the description of the video. So there is an entire genre of politicians, of political parties, of non-fiction, of fiction. We talked about Mark Stein, you had Badior, of course yourself. I think there's no need to diminish your contribution to this debate. So this whole, oh my God, who could have seen it coming? Everybody who had eyes to see saw it coming. And we did even see it, just as a reminder, you even saw it a little bit during the Arab Spring, if you remember Lara Logan, right? There is, again, I think it's maybe because it's a young average age, it's more testosterone. I'm sure there is an explanation for it, but the explanation does not change the fact that when it comes to sexual violence, and particularly sexual violence towards women that are perceived as being part of an out-group, whether they are Christians, whether they're Coptic, you had similar things in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem. This is something that is happening, and it's very annoying that we cannot even have an open debate about this, because you immediately, this is what some commenters accused me of in our previous conversation, and it's true, I really do it, I have to apologize for it, that one immediately says, well, I don't want to sound racist, I don't want to sound judgmental, but that you immediately have to precede every argument you make with, but I really don't mean it. It's true. I'm a victim of the things I criticize myself. That is very true.
So, okay. What I want to know is, obviously the word racist is so weaponized, and I mean, on the one hand, I understand it's weaponized. On the other hand, I don't understand why people care. That's the part I don't get. Okay, it's kind of like it's been weaponized, but why do you let it be a weapon against you? Why can't you see through it and be like, you know what? Call me racist all you want. I don't care. All right, but okay, so it's been weaponized. What I'm trying to understand now, all these authorities who don't believe these women, right, that we're talking about. Is it literally because they are afraid of the word racist? Or could it be that, I mean, because I read different things, and is it because maybe they just, I heard a lot of it as a class thing. They look down on a lot of these working class women, and it's just kind of like, you're garbage anyway, who cares? That sort of thing. Because it's important to understand all the facets involved. I mean, I know for a fact the racist card is one of the top, if not the top one. But what other elements are involved in this sort of, denial and lack of cooperation from the authorities?
Well, it's a good question, and I think that the element you mentioned, a certain element of snobbery, I think is absolutely true. And I would argue that the genuine fear of being called a racist apparently really has, particularly apparently in the police force and in the public administration, has more power than one would think. But let me tell you a story. This is, I think it's in the book Lights Out by Mark Stein, and this story stuck with me. So it goes like this. Mark Stein describes it. Everybody can look it up. There is it's in an office, and and for whatever reason that the police comes in, and the white guy says to his black coworker, now they're coming for you. No, not the greatest joke in the world, but it was meant as a joke. The black coworker laughed it off, right? No big deal. It was not the greatest joke, but nothing bad. A third person heard it and then reported the guy to HR. And you can read the full story in Mark Stein's book, but to cut the long story short, it ended with the guy pretty much blowing his own head off. So this is the thing. So it's not just an emotional pressure that comes from being called a racist. You can actually be exposed to genuine, life-threatening or income-threatening, career-threatening consequences by some guy who wasn't even involved. That's the fascinating thing. Who wasn't even involved in the conversation. Now let me add on a bigger number to this. In Germany alone, last year, the government spent 25 million euros. I mean, I know these days when we only talk about billions and trillions, that doesn't seem that much, but in the realm of NGOs, 25 millions is not a small sum. And that's only for so-called anti-Muslim racism. So immediately when you and I have these conversations, if we would have that conversation in Germany, right, there would be a significant chance that some government-financed NGO would say, Raymond and Ralph, what they say is anti-Muslim racism. And maybe hypothetically, we work for a German company. They would not come to us and say, man, what you guys say is a problem. They would go to our employer, and our employer would say, I could defend Raymond and Ralph, but is it worth the hassle? So all of a sudden you find yourself in HR hell and in sensitivity training and whatnot. So there is a pressure system also in place.
The chilling effect.
A chilling effect, precisely. And I would imagine that's also the case, at least with some members of the British police. I refuse, and maybe I'm naive, but I refuse that everybody willingly turned a blind eye or was participating. But I can
that
imagine
would be hard.
scenarios.
That would be so hard to. I mean, I don't know if it's hard to believe. It's hard. It is so hard to believe, but I don't know anymore at this point. To me, the idea that a word can so paralyze people. This idea, I call you a racist and now you fall down on your face and you give up your girls to get raped. Like, how did this happen? How did we get to this pass? I know that's a big question, but it's just again, I always ask you this. I ask these questions of everyone.
I mean, no, I think it's a great question. And I would say there is a tendency, and this worries me, that we sooner or later will also have these grooming gangs with perpetrators of a non-migrant background, because I'm a sincere believer that if you don't punish devious behavior or deviancy, you will get more of it. So I'm sure this whole grooming gang started probably very small. But, the authorities didn't do anything. They turned a blind eye. So more and more men got involved, and then this whole thing started to grow, and nobody did anything about it. So more and more people started to participate. And as I said, I think for you and I, there still is call it a civilizational barrier. It's like, so I don't know anybody. I could not pick up the phone and call someone and say, hey, listen, I have a 15-year-old girl in my basement. You want to come over? I wouldn't know whom to call. And if I would call somebody, they would report me to the police. But once you have this kind of milieu where this is possible, this grows very quickly. And I was speaking to some of the people who were really involved in the investigations. And one of the things that surprised them the most was that very often, for example, the wives of the perpetrators knew about this, but they tolerated it. And this tells me something that you have talked about quite eloquently, right? That there is a cultural factor, because I think, I guess men can be, we had the Pellico case in France. We had I'm sure people are about the Fritzl case in Austria, right? The guy who locked his daughter up for 12 years in the basement and had 4 children with her. So it is absolutely. So when people say this is not just happening within one culture, that is absolutely true. But it was done clandestinely. It was, but the Pellico case is slightly different. But at least the Fritzl case was he hid it in his basement. This was not something where he called up his neighbors and said, "Hey, you want to come over? I have this girl in this case, his own daughter, locked up in the basement." But in the grooming gang case, it's really the involvement of the large number of people. But if you don't stomp out this kind of misbehavior, if it happens on a small scale, you will automatically get a larger scale. And it's the weird idea that we have taken over, or that the idea has taken over the West, that we truly are all good people, and the few that deviate from being good, don't punish them too hard. You just have to explain to them. You just have to carefully and softly bring them back into civilized society. Generally, I believe that I think everybody has the potential to be good, but also everybody has the potential to give in to the most horrific temptations if they present themselves. And and by the way, you also have group pressure, particularly among young men. So it's, I guess, if this sounds horrible, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. But if you are then in a group of young men, or in many cases middle-aged or even older men, and everybody participates, if you don't participate, right, you probably come under pressure yourself, because they say, well, why are you not going along with this? What's your problem? Are you not a real man?
That's in the report. That's actually in the report, where it talks about along with being groomed and raped by older men, a lot of these women talk about how they brought younger men, 18, and they were like pressuring them to also participate in the fun. So it's all there. And the point, though, is this whole racism and being paralyzed and all that sort of thing. One of the thoughts that I've always had, which is because everything that's happening is so beyond ironic in many ways, because it's always the exact opposite. Okay, so like the white man is presented as the epitome of evil. He's racist. He's this horrible person, even though he's opened his doors to everyone and given his children up to get raped. But I think the irony is, and you alluded to it, which is that a lot of the people of Western European culture, the reason you can shame them and call them racist and they actually respond to it is because they are conscientious people. Okay,
agreed.
You could never use this with anyone else. If you went up to Africans and Middle Easterners and Arabs and Asians and said, "You're racist," they would just be like, "Yeah," and okay, but because the people of the West have such a developed sense of ethics and conscientiousness, and because there is that leftover residue of Christianity, okay, when they hear that, they bristle. I don't want to be a bad person judging someone by their color, so they freak out. So it's interesting because because they are good, that's being used against them to make them feel guilty. And they've bought into the lie that, yeah, my history, my culture, my heritage is the most evil one, and therefore it's my job now. It's payback. Haven't you heard that? It's payback time. Now it's my turn to do. Yeah, we have to be raped. We have to be colonized. We have to suffer. We have to take it. And so I find that highly ironic, amazing, and more than anything diabolical. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely correct. And since I'm a Christian myself, I think I'm maybe not entitled, but I think I can say this without being a hypocrite. There is an issue, and if you want a philosophical one within Christianity, which is this emphasis, which can be very beautiful, but it also can be very dangerous, right? The idea that kind of how to put this, it depends on which people you applied. But for example, and as we discussed, so there's the idea that there is even that the same happens when we talk about wokeness, right? That there is a certain hierarchy of victimhood, and that those who are perceived to be on a lower rung of that ladder, they're automatically morally superior. So if your perception of the world is, whether it's in the post-Christian West or whichever country you want to take, that, for example, the Pakistani migrant is on a lower rung, then you also kind of grant this person, to some extent, supposedly moral superiority. Now, if that person then does something terrible, you have a really hard time condemning it, right? Because it's this whole the last will be first, and the downtrodden will inherit the earth. All of this. Now, I think it's a wrong interpretation of Christianity. I'm not defending it, but I think you see this a lot, and it goes back to what you said, right? So because the white guy, if you want, the white male, the white heterosexual male, is like on the top of the ladder. So only that person, only that individual, only that group, they are the only ones who can be genuine perpetrators, which is why you had to give another example. I mean, it's so ironic. I'm sure that many of your viewers, particularly those in the United States, will remember there were all these headlines about fraternities who supposedly, gang raped all these girls in I think in Virginia and whatnot, where it turned out, or this was something that Ann Coulter did a lot of work on,
Duke lacrosse players, right? A lot of this turned out to be a complete hoax, like not genuinely a hoax. Like a lot of these things never happened, but it was immediately believed because it fits the narrative, right? Or the belief system that these were rich white boys from elite universities, they must be rapists. It was like the perfect, Law and Order SVU episode. Kind of, it fit the pattern perfectly. And if you have a case like in the UK, it's not just that we debate the numbers. There's always this element of disbelief. Is it made up? Did it really happen? Are there maybe some socioeconomic factors?
How can a white person be a victim? That's so
yes,
it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
You're 100% correct. And this, I recently participated in a debate with Mehdi Hassan on Al Jazeera, and it was a very odd thing. But the idea that something like Islamization, if you want, Islamization in the sense, right, that these things happen and that they have a theological component to it. It's, you're treated like if you're a mad person, like you're seeing things, you're hallucinating things. And by the way, it works because, again, this is my fault that I have to apologize to viewers, because I always then catch myself that all of a sudden I'm thinking, am I hallucinating it? Right? Is it possible that I'm wrong? And this always bothers me, again, about this like cognitive behavioral therapy I'm doing right here with you. But then I really have to tell myself, no, this is reality. This is why I was so saddened by the content, but grateful that Rupert Lowe, that they made this report, and whatever flaws might be in it, that now it's written down. And by the way, I would say, I know contentious topic, I'd be very careful here, so because the details are still sketchy. But you saw it a little bit also with the Epstein files, right? Where immediately and maybe again, I'm not saying, to be very clear, I'm not saying it's not true, but kind of immediately the claim of mass, pedophilia, sexual violence was taken for granted. Whereas in the British case, it took 13 years to publish a report on it. And I would argue there is a kind of racism at work, but it goes the other direction than the media wants to make you believe.
Okay, so this report, which, and I don't know, I know it's, I think it's, I read the foreword, I think it's by Rupert Lowe, so I don't know if it's being somehow sponsored by Restore Britain, or, what the connection is, but be that as it may, I think it's a great thing, and I'm glad it's being done. What impact, if any, do you think this will even have?
I mean, I think it already had massive impact. The two new political movements in the UK, both Restore and Reform. I mean, there was a by-election just 24 hours ago where both of them did not do very well. But I think, this, starting new political movements in a political system like the UK is very difficult. It's like starting a new political, slightly different, but you can compare it to trying to start a new political party in the United States. So the kind of success that they're having is already quite impressive. And the grooming gang issue has been front and center for kind of the rise of Reform and potentially of Restore now for at least the last two or 3 years. And one has to admit also that the one person who picked this up and really put it front and center was, love him or hate him, was Elon Musk. Kind of it was him who really, so the switch from Elon Musk to kind of pick up on these issues on a global scale, because one could say, why does Elon Musk care what's happening in the UK? Why does he care what's happening in Belfast? That really made a difference, because his voice, again, whatever you think of him, but his voice is one that is very difficult to ignore. And it's kind of, they tried it after the event where he supposedly did the Hitler salute and all of this. So they really tried to paint him in that corner, but it's very difficult. It's because he doesn't fit that corner. And by the way, just as an amusing side note, that corner gets pretty crowded. I mean, isn't the guy who's running for Senator of Maine for the Democrats with the death hat, the Waffen-SS tattoo on his chest? So,
yeah, So let me ask you this. This is a true distinction, okay? If you go back 10, the further we go back, the worse it was, and because we didn't have the nature of the internet, which is great because people can, communicate, social media and whatnot, by which I mean the mainstream media, the elites had power of the knowledge of the information that came to us. So now this information would have never come to us 20 years ago because they would have made sure it wouldn't. Now we have this kind of information. Do you think that will, so do you think this is a matter of information being suppressed And now that the information is becoming publicly available to the Britons in particular, Western people in general, do you think it's a matter of information? In other words, if enough people, Western people, know what's really happening because they didn't, that is going to be a major catalyst for change. Or, and this is where it becomes a little more philosophical, and we go back to this sort of paralytic racism, we're scared. Or is it still that's the main issue? Even if people know the facts, even if the whole world, if every last Western European knew this, they're still scared of being called racist. So to what impact do you think gaining this knowledge will actually have results on the ground?
I think it's going to have an impact, and you can see it particularly in continental Europe, in the way in which also the political, I wouldn't just say the establishment, the political institutions are reacting, right? All these debates that we are still having about banning X or replacing X. I think there is, by the way, just as we are speaking right now, I don't think anybody is using it, but there is this new, I forgot even the name. It's not a very catchy name. There is not Blue Sky, but there's yet another social media platform that was created and approved by the European Union. So there is the deliberate attempt kind of to create these, I wouldn't even call it echo chambers, to create these information environments where you are shielded from the issues that you and I are debating. But the problem is it's not catching on. People are not moving into those environments because the idea, yes, X has changed. I think there's some issues with the algorithm. There's a lot of clickbaiting and click chasing out there. So there's a lot of room for improvement. But if you follow the right accounts, for example, I said, if you follow your account and a couple of other people, you still can get very valid, very valuable information. So it's a little bit also depending on the user, what you want. But certain stories I think we would not have heard about. I mean, just today, this one person who apparently threw a 3-year-old child into the
crocodile.
The crocodile. I'm not sure if you would have, at least not in that short amount of time.
What is it?
Right?
I mean, the word surreal doesn't do it justice anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
And the same is true when we look at things like beheadings in public streets. So it's not just what was attempted in Belfast, but you had, as I think, Samuel Paty in France, right, who was beheaded in public. You had Lee Rigby, the drummer in the UK, and one could say, well, but that's only a handful of cases. Yeah, but again, you don't want to live in the world where you have the genuine risk of walking out the front door and somebody's getting beheaded in the street. This is just. It wasn't like this. The point is not to be nostalgic towards a past that never existed. It's like some very basic things like, please don't behead people in the streets. I mean, generally, I would say the people and the public are very modest in their demands.
Yeah,
right? They want to, They want to continue to use the parks. They want to continue to, wherever it's possible, to leave the door unlocked. Like it's they want their daughters to feel safe. Like these are all very minor demands by the population. This is not some crazy stuff. It's kind of things that have been common, just a couple of years ago. Now I immediately hasten to add, right? This does not mean that there was no crime in the past. That doesn't mean that there was no rape in the past. All of these things happened. But what did not happen?
It was just 1%. It was 1% of what it is.
Precisely. And the numbers, every European country that is creating reliable statistics on this show that people from certain areas are overrepresented when it comes to certain crimes. And sometimes they're overrepresented by a factor of 5, 6, or 7. Even if you, by the way, control for agents. So the report
this report basically. This report, I'll probably get to it in another part, but I remember the number. I'm very close. It said something like 90%. It's Muslims, but Muslims, according to their statistics, are 6% of the population. So imagine you have a 6% population committing 90% of the rapes. Okay, but now you said something which I want to add to. You were talking about how what the European population wants is very modest. Okay, which I agree with. And excuse me, you get to a point where you realize something. All that the European politicians had to do is nothing to make Europe a utopia. Okay, which is why I insist that this is not this is active. Okay, in other words, when Tony Blair, 1997, mass migration. Okay, so he did something. He actively did something. If he was a politician like who just, I'm not going to do anything, nothing would have changed. Okay, you wouldn't have this. But they actively did something that brought in this hostile mentality, Islam, Pakistanis, etc., who prey on precisely the kind of people that you've degraded your own people into becoming. Okay, and lo and behold, this is happening. So when you say, you know, that the people, what they want is modest, well, absolutely. What they really want is for the politicians to do nothing. Okay, now they have to do something. But if it was, let's say, 1950s Britain, 60s, whatever, before the mass migration, I mean, there, you know, I know Muslims and Pakistanis were there as far as early as 1955, but whatever the case may be, if they did nothing, then everything would have actually, these countries, no countries are utopia, okay, but they would be so far much better. They wouldn't have these crimes. The women can go out in public and not worry about being mauled and raped and groomed, etc. People could go out at night without being afraid. People, Muslims and migrants wouldn't be abusing the system financially, etc., etc. So they actively created this, and this is one thing that I always want people to understand. Okay,
So
this didn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, they actively created it, and I would say they did so against the resistance of the population. The bigger problem was that the population lacked the imagination that they would be really doing this. I just want to return for 1 second to Enoch Powell in 1968, when he gave his Rivers of Blood speech. The reaction by the establishment was outrage, and it was I think it was the London Times, or one of the major British newspapers at the time.
Tell us about this River of Blood speech.
So basically, first of all, you know, Enoch Powell was a politician, right, in the 1960s. A very smart man. Spoke several languages fluently. So not the kind of right-wing populist of the kind of brand that we have today. A classic, we could say, snobbish, upper-class British guy. But he was getting letters from his constituents, right? And we talk about the 1960s here, where you already had things like public security, the sense of safety disappearing, where people were worried and complaining about. Again, we're talking about the 1960s, about the consequences of these early steps of mass migration. So he gave this speech, and they also did a very interesting TV interview at the time, where he said that if we continue on this course, what's then going to happen is it will lead to civil unrest. It will lead to clashes. Or he didn't call it, supposedly these rivers of blood. And he gave this interview where he did a debate with another politician, and the other politician said, "Well, what's the big deal? What's the problem if few people come in?" And he very correctly said, because the quantity matters. There's a difference if it's 10 people that come in or if it is 1 million people that come in. And the interesting thing about his career was that was according to, I forgot which British newspaper it was. They said they got, I think, 30,000 letters, and not a single one was against Powell's position. All of them were supportive of his position. He was a right-wing politician, and you had then left-wing demonstrators who said, "Don't knock Enoch." So it was kind of basically were going on the streets for him. So the sense of the people that something.
This is 1960s.
1968, right? We talk about, this was 60 years ago. So the idea that is sometimes being perpetrated, that public resistance to migration is a new phenomenon, that it's what's the term, rebel rousers, so that the right wing, that it's alarmists that cause it. So everything would be fine and dandy if there wouldn't be social media. I mean, I'm not saying that social media doesn't play a role, but the general sense that something's off starts in the 1960s. And if you go through the speeches of General de Gaulle, if you hear Helmut Kohl talking in the 80s, as you correctly said, everybody knew, everybody started to see, man, this is just not going to work out. Yet for some reason that I guess we would have to make an entire show on this. In the 90s, because it's not just 2015 with Angela Merkel, it starts in the 90s, as you correctly mentioned, Tony Blair. There was this idea to completely double down on this. Now, I do believe that at least one aspect out of multiple was that the left thought this is a way to import new voters. So I think there's an ideological component to it. I'm sure there is a
a religious component to it. But I think there's also this idea, you know what, if the people of Britain will no longer vote for us, we're just going to import new voters. I do think that also played a role.
So the most important component, I mean, all that you said I agree with, the most important component is that we are ignoring the majority's will, okay? Because ever since the 60s, you're right, I wasn't even aware of this. I mean, I assumed mass migration is what really piqued people's interest in Britain, but I would have assumed that in the 70s it was such a little known thing. But to know that in the 60s you already had politicians calling it out, calling it rivers of blood, okay, and all they've done is bring more and more, and all the people have done is complain more and more, and like you said, they just double down and just bring more. And this is just it's so mind-boggling that. And this is why, for me, I've reached the point. I'm the guy that talks about Islam. You know, I've been talking about Islam for 20 years. But if you really want to talk about the source, this is no longer Islam. The real source, the real problem is the people enabling it, the people bringing it to you, the people putting them there. Because this is not, again, the medieval era where Muslims are invading and there's nothing you can do. No, there's everything you can do. This is why, you know, we met in Hungary, you and I. That country doesn't have this problem. How hard was it? Did they have an army fighting and went to war against Muslims? No, they put a little fence. And meanwhile, you have these Western nations where the people are begging and crying for 50 years, and the government continues doing the same thing. Now, you mentioned England. You're from Austria. Was it in Austria, as we spoke in our interview, which is, I think most people are going to be amazed by this, you know, Vienna, you know, once the seat of the Holy Roman Empire is now Muslim majority. At least public schools are more Muslim majority than Catholics or Austrians in general. Was it the same? And we spoke also, you know, about the Sobieski statue and the city council saying no. So is it the same thing in Vienna, which is basically that the people from of old, from back in the 50s and 60s, actually were, you know, aware and wary and resistant to, let's say, this mass migration, the way that example you gave from the 60s, or were they not? In other words, was this an overall kind of you know, universal European thing, which is we're not into it, even as back as the 50s and 60s, but it was suppressed and we didn't hear that? Or were there populations who were like, yeah, it's great, let's do it?
In Austria, it started in the 90s. Okay. There you had you can literally trace the Austrian right wing was always between 7-8% in the polls, unless they started to really focus on the migration issue, and all of a sudden they went up to 15-20%, and now they're polling at 37%. I mean, I think the UK and France was always different because they had this influx of migration due to their colonial past. Austria never had colonies, whether it was in Northern Africa or anywhere else.
So, explain that to people, because this colonial thing, you know, I mean, you know, to Americans, most Americans don't get this, that a lot of these European countries, for example, the UK has a lot of Pakistanis because they colonized Pakistan and India, and they feel somehow beholden to them, that, oh, we colonized you, so now it's time you can come and colonize us. Like that mentality. That's a thing, right? I mean, like in France, I know they have a lot of Algerians and North Africans because they colonized those countries. So is it once again this sort of guilt, you know, this little guilt trip that because, you know, the colonial era has been so demonized, even though it shouldn't be if you actually know what happened. And because of that, now people feel beholden and guilty. And now, okay, all you Pakistanis can now come and, you know, rape our kids because, you know, we were monsters and we colonized you 100 years ago.
I think that's absolutely the case. And yeah, I mean, there's almost, I try to give a very elaborate answer, but the answer is actually quite simple. Yes. I mean, this idea of historic guilt,
which goes back, sorry to cut you off, but it goes back to what I was saying, which is this idea that the only person who would ever fall for this is someone who has such an overdeveloped sense of conscience. Because if I went and told Muslims, you know, you guys did a lot of bad things to Christians for a millennium, isn't it time to treat us better? They'd kill you. So you find the one population that, because they're good and ethical and actually care, You exploit them, and exploit them by telling them you're the most horrible people ever, and they buy it.
I think that's true, but I would add, and as always, we're very cautious. I don't kind of want to generalize, but I'm wondering if there is not also, if it's not a little bit built in to Christian societies, because the Christian is always looking for redemption. He's always looking for atonement, and of course, in order to atone, you need a sin. And it turns out that colonialism and imperialism was almost offering itself as I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean, as almost the perfect sin for which we can now atone. Slavery was no longer around, so that there was the possibility, and I make this very consciously, this argument, the kind of as Jesus did, right? That you can no longer wash the feet of the servant because the servants are no longer around, but you can wash the feet of the refugee. And we had popes who actually did this, right? I think it was, and I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I think it was the previous pope who did wash in the Vatican, Francis, the feet of Syrian refugees. So this I would say very starkly supports the point that I'm trying to make. There is always a certain pleasure, if you want, in being guilty and then atone for it, even if it comes, and what higher atonement can there be than sacrificing your civilization, sacrificing your present and your future for the sins of the past? Am I exaggerating? Absolutely. But do I think that there is a kernel of truth to this? I do think so, because you don't have these qualms in any other name one other civilization, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Turkish, that looks back at their imperial past and says, oh my God, this is horrible. I mean, they tried to do it to Japan, but the Japanese and they were, very brutal imperial overlords wherever they set foot. But to this day, they have, I think, this shrine where prime ministers go to, I think, like the World War II generals or what it is. And let's just say that they don't have fully succumbed to this idea that imperialism was bad. And this is kind of Russia. I would argue the same thing. Whatever problems Russia has, right? This self-flagellation. Maybe it's a Catholic and Protestant thing, and the Orthodox are more resilient to it. But in the case of France and the UK and I mean, for Germany, it's the ersatz religion, right? For the Germans, it's neither Protestantism nor Catholicism. There, of course, is the Third Reich, and that means you have to do atonement to the whole world. But it's a very odd thing, and it's, to be very clear, this is publicly being said. You mentioned it, but this is being said, that you were the imperialists in the past, you were the colonialists in the past, and now you get a taste of your own medicine. But what I find so ironic about this, by saying that, they're basically admitting that colonialism is a bad thing. So it's a very odd argument to say, why are you terrified of people coming in? You did the same thing in the past and it was very bad, so it's also very bad now. But this idea that we will reach some kind of cosmic justice where there will be some form of balance, right? Then we can say, oh, we were really bad in the past, but now we made up for it, and now everybody goes their separate ways. That's never going to happen. And this is, by the way, and can you know more about this than I do, but this is never how human history has worked. History is not striving towards a moral equilibrium. This is it's an interesting assumption. It's one I think that we can debate at great length from a philosophical perspective, but there's zero evidence for this. And so this attempt that one day somebody will rise up and then metaphorically shake the hands of the Europeans and say, and now your sins are forgiven. Like the scene in the Return of the King.
We've raped enough of your girls. You're okay now. You're exonerated, and you have absolution. Yeah.
Never gonna happen.
So, okay, your point about the Christianity, that's a very important point. That's a whole episode. That's a whole book, actually, which I am kind of working on. But I agree with you. All right. So I do believe that a lot of what we're seeing is in large measure, in part because of the way Christians in the West see the religion. My argument, however, is that is not true Christianity. That is a complete heresy. That is a complete aberration that has been weaponized, okay, by people who don't like Christianity to make Christians basically kill themselves. Because if you look
it's
at
post-Christian Christianity, that's what it's like.
yes,
It's a Christianity of post-Christians. Yeah, I
yes,
completely agree.
it's a post-Christianity, and if you look at the history of Christianity, man, it was robust. This wouldn't happen, okay? All throughout Europe, there were Christians, and these were Christians who were willing to die for their faith, unlike modern people. And you're not going to go into their country and rape their girls, okay? Yeah. And there's nothing in the Bible that actually advocates that. So my point is, I agree with you that one of the major, like almost fundamental problem, I call it doormat Christianity, but what I mean by that is Christianity has been turned into this idea that, you know, your faith begins and ends with being a doormat, and all you have to do is just be complacent and acquiesce to everyone. Don't judge, don't be confrontational. That's all evil, that's all sinful. And like I said, this is a whole different topic for another time, but in short, I'm sorry, that is not Christianity. That's not Christ's Christianity. That's not the apostles. That's not the Bible's. That's not history's Christianity. That is a sick, perverse form that is killing Western society. So when someone says, and they often do, oh, Christianity is the problem, I agree, only in the sense that it's a false form of Christianity that is completely emasculating and killing people. So yeah, I do agree with you, but I'm hopeful that the true form of Christianity, which has intentionally been suppressed, may one day resurrect again.
No, I think that's true, and it's one of the sadder parts, I believe, particularly again in the Western world, is we have become so thoroughly materialistic. And to be very clear, I have no problem with material stuff. On the contrary, the material world is very important, but we can't even imagine any longer that there is also, let's call it the realm of the spiritual, if you want. And
the metaphysical. There's the physical and the metaphysical.
Yeah. Very good.
And exactly. We've ignored the metaphysical, and all we care about is the physical.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think both of those are important, but we completely neglect one at the expense of the other, which is this idea then once again that you can solve every cultural problem with more public housing and a social worker there and an extra check here, and this is just in many ways not how human beings function.
To give you a perfect example of this division between physical and metaphysical, and the fact that we in the West, even Christians, cling to the physical and completely there is no metaphysical. I'll give you a perfect example that fits into what we're talking about. So, in Britain, okay, at least if you can prove it, rape is bad because it's physical. Murder is bad if you can prove it. But because we've abandoned metaphysics, this is why, I don't know if you saw, I was talking earlier and I was saying all these girls before Muslims were in households that taught them, go ahead, have sex, go ahead and do drugs, go ahead. There is no metaphysical morality. Everything was just, go do anything as long as you don't hurt anyone, because that's all we care about, physical. And that's good. Don't hurt anyone. I'm not arguing that. But there was morality, and even Muslims understand that. And that's in part one of the reasons why they really mistreat these people, because they see them like you're an animal. I can do anything I want to. And that's in the report, okay? So I think that is really, and people will never talk about this. This is the problem. The West has abandoned morality, okay? Metaphysical morality. Its morality begins and ends in a physical construct, which means it's bad to kill, it's bad to rape, it's bad to hurt someone. But they don't tell you like, oh yeah, it's bad to go and sleep with 10 guys when you're 10 years old. It's bad to get drunk 20, and do drugs. And they don't tell you that. And that is what feeds into this predator society that they've also brought in. And that's why I say it's such a warped symbiotic relationship, where you've completely, weakened one group of people by convincing them there's no metaphysics. It's all physical, and, live a life of hedonism. Then you bring another group of people who are so predatory and you introduce them. It's really diabolical.
No, and you're so right. And the other problem, that the state, if you want, it can no longer speak the language of the metaphysic. But of course, that is.
Do you ever hear the word morality? Have you ever heard a Western politician, say the word morality or honor, okay, or being noble or acting dignified? I mean, these were words that actuated wars historically. Do we even know what that means anymore? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, this is why you end up with, again, no personal attack, but this is then how you end up with, from a moral perspective, whether it's Bill Clinton or Donald Trump, right? I guess you could even
At least when it comes to women, I think probably JFK also falls slightly into that category. No, that this is very true, and that also feeds into this weird idea then that ultimately the state can only be a neutral arbiter among different groups that all have an equal claim to truth. So it's the state then all of a sudden is no longer supposed to take any side. And I think this is just not a sustainable model, right? Because as we just discussed, and as kind of also based on this report, if you have one culture that says that, treating women like chattel is fine, and another one that says no, it's not, then the government or the state cannot say, well, whatever's your cup of tea, we don't really care. And and Americans know this very well. I know there are multiple layers and dimensions to the American Civil War, but I think ultimately it was, you cannot be a unified state where one half is pro-slavery and the other half is against it. Again, I know there is more. I know there is more to this, but if we take this simplified version, and I think, of course, again, the same is, this is when people don't understand. We need to distinguish between multi-ethnic societies and multicultural societies. Mm-hmm. You can be multi-ethnic but monocultural, and that is not a problem. Switzerland has 4 ethnicities. I would say that Germany has more than one ethnicity. Just compare somebody from Hamburg to somebody from Munich. If you run around in lederhosen in northern Germany, they think you have lost your mind. So there is a difference, but I think they're culturally the same. I think the United Kingdom is multi-ethnic, Scottish, Welsh, English, but they are in certain areas monocultural. So you then can have an army where Scots and Welsh and English fight side by side, whether it's World War I or World War II. And I don't fear a multi-ethnic society, but I do fear a multicultural society, because for me, there is no historical evidence that they have ever worked, at least not in a democratic system, right? Because at some point, then the government has to suppress some cultures and favor others. But
I think I agree with you completely, and I think the problem is that they've convinced people that the word culture means different cuisine, different dress, different attire. Actually, the word culture, the word culture, if you really look at it, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of life, it's priorities, it's what's the first things, it's based on religion. So how is it good to be multicultural? And I agree with you. You can be multi-ethnic, which is to say you can have all different races. But if they share the same priorities, worldview, standards, ethics, okay, it's fine. Well, what difference does it make what his skin color is if he thinks like you and shares your values? But if you bring in, different people and they have different cultures, you know what that means? Oh, okay, so one culture called Islam thinks women are chattel, thinks men beat their wives, thinks men can rape and enslave infidels because they're not Muslim, and all that sort of thing. And then you have another culture, which, of course, thinks all of that is anathema. So how is it ever smart to take all these different worldviews, religious priorities, and put them together? What's going to happen? What's going to happen is precisely what we're seeing. And to show you the example even more pronouncedly, if you look at, again, the point of culture is like worldviews, priorities, and all that sort of thing. So you can look at, let's say, America or even England, and just look at the white population. Some are leftist, some are rightist, and they hate each other, but they're the same culture. They are racially homogenous, but I'm not the same culture. They're the same race. But because they're culturally different, which is to say not that they eat different food, but they see the world differently, well, they hate each other. If you ever hear how, the left and the woke talk about Trump and MAGA and vice versa. So it has nothing to do with your skin color or your pigmentation or racial or eye features. But the word culture, that is a problem. You don't want different cultures among you because that's chaos.
No, I agree. And I would even go a step further. But this is open for debate. But for me, the first starting point for any culture, you said priorities, and I like that very much. And for me, it's a priority of affection. So when somebody would ask me, okay, fine, Ralph, so then what is German culture? What is Austrian culture? What is British culture? For me, the first answer would be, it is a sense of affection and belonging to a nation, to a country and its history.
And if you don't have this, right, every other step along the way, you start with this affection and you end up with fish and chips. But if you don't have the first step, you don't really get to the last one. And you can have a situation. This is why I do have to admit that I do see parts of the left as part of an alien culture, because, again, some of them, because they do not share and openly reject that sense of affection. And so you cannot make the argument the essence of British culture is to hate Britain. I mean, I guess you can, but only for a very, very short period of time. And that's for me always the key thing. When there is then always the argument, or again, this goes back to what we said about the metaphysical thing. We think in such physical terms that we forget how important the emotional component is as well. So we then say it's nature, or la France profonde, right? It's something that we can touch. But no, it is, and it's fine to say that it's a feeling. When I think of Germany, when I think of Austria, it does something to me. I think in a good way. It's a sense, I look at the history and I feel it, I perceive it, the good and the bad, as my history. Like I cheer the successes, I lament the losses, and I regret the mistakes that were made, in a way that I do not, for example, for Turkey, because it's not mine. Like I have no problem with Turkey, but I don't have this sense of affection. I have it for Britain, I have it for America, right? It's like concentric circles where I have this sense. But we have a growing number of people within our countries who do not share that sentiment, and that is a problem. It's very difficult to have solidarity within a society or common sense if people no longer feel that they have something in common. This was the main reason what shocked me so much during the whole BLM thing, and whatever one thinks about it. The kneeling during the American anthem. If a society cannot even agree on something, to say we all show the same amount of respect towards the flag and the anthem, and then we discuss all the policy issues, I think it's very, very difficult to keep a country together under such conditions. So I am to just as a quick add-on. The test of a society, or the idea is not that a society never goes through a crisis. There are always crises. There were crises in the 19th century, in the 20th. Like I think it's part of the human experience. The question is, do you survive them, and do you come out stronger at the end? That is the big question. And I'm no longer sure if our societies are as resilient as they have been in the past. That's my biggest worry. I mean,
how did they weaken? What do you think made them weaker? You said they were stronger in the past, and I completely agree with you. None of what we're seeing would have happened in the past. Why have they weakened to this state, do you think? Because it's obviously a philosophical development, maybe even theological.
I think we have to line up a whole series of podcasts as we go.
I know it's late for you, and you shared a lot. We can wrap it up now for you if you'd like.
No. I love these topics. No, I love these topics. I can go on for another. I'm just worried that your viewers will start tuning out. I think that these. No. These are the fundamental questions, and I would argue that something that for millennia, I think we took completely as normal, this idea that the human individual is part of a group, and that the group can put certain demands on the individual and vice versa, right? It's a symbiosis between the individual and the collective, if you want. We have completely given up on the collective side. So the idea that you might, hopefully you never have to, but that there might be a point in time where you have to go out, pick up a gun, and fight, kill, and die for your country, was seen as terrible, but normal and sometimes warranted. Nowadays, it seems almost perverse. It seems, why would you kill yourself or get killed for your country? What's the benefit?
Violence is never the answer.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. And this is, again, I'm not wishing for it. I think it's I hope, I've been in the military, I hope I never get drafted and never have to fight in a war. But for a very long time, this was seen as normal, whether it was for your tribe, whether it was for your country, whichever entity you ultimately fought for, because it was understood that there is this, this give and take, if you want, between the group and the individual. And I'm not a collectivist, don't get me wrong. But this was, I think, a very, very important element. And we have these glimpses. I give you a concrete example. If you look at the behavior of particularly men on the Titanic, on the HMS Birkenhead, on the Lusitania, right? This whole women and children first was not just something that existed on paper. For the most part, it was actually, when the test came, right, when the ships sunk, most men, not all of them, but most, lived up to those standards. Compare this with ship tragedies, the Costa Concordia, or there was a ferry in Finland, how men behaved in in these more recent cases, where they stepped over children, where they pushed women out of the way. So some of the nostalgia of the past is warranted. These were different societies. Right? It was completely common in World War I that the sons of the nobility fought in the front lines, and many of them died. Right? So this, because it was seen as a duty, it was seen as an obligation towards your country. Now, some people might say this is old-fashioned, this is reactionary. That might all be true, but it made for a very, very, very strong nation. It made for the very nations that gave us the modern world. And I think we have lost that. Once again, I'm not promoting a war or something, but there was a time when a significant part of the population, particularly the upper classes, did live up to the standards that were expected from them. Not all of them, but many. I mean, Gertrude Himmelfarb has written about, I think she died recently, but she has written wonderfully about this. And there is a difference. As I said, I don't want to glorify the past too much, but there are these elements.
You're actually saying something. I just wrote an article. I did a video, but I wrote an article that came out today. So and it really jibes with what you just said. So let me summarize it to you and see if you agree with it, which is basically, okay, 250 years ago was the American Revolution, the War of Independence. And if you look at it, so you had colonists who were mostly British subjects of England, and you had the British monarchy. And okay, long story short, they got into a quarrel. What was it about? It was about taxation without representation. That was the heart of it. Okay, tea taxes, a little political overreach and whatnot. Okay, and for that, the founders of America went to war. Okay, they killed, they died, they pillaged and plundered. They were pillage and plunder war. Okay, for those reasons. Now, growing up in America, I was taught they were heroes, okay? And we still celebrate them. Now, okay, keep that paradigm in mind. And now let's fast forward to England 250 years later. Again, British government and subject peoples. If you look at what's happening, the things that we're talking about, just this grooming sexual business alone, okay? So we already summarized it. The government bringing in, okay, so to summarize it, now imagine instead of it was a tea tax and political stuff, the British Crown was doing this. It was sending loads and loads of Muslims and Pakistanis, people from alien cultures, to America. And these Muslims started raping their children and molesting them and horrific stuff, okay, and abusing the system and just creating basically terrorism. And then when the Americans are like, what on earth are you doing? The British actually doubled down some more. Okay. If they went to war for what they did, how do you think they would have responded in this current climate? And after you answer that question, answer to me why then are the Brits not responding that way? Because in the end, we have to come up with one conclusion. Either the American heroes were actually horrible warmongers and insurrectionists and rabble rousers and deplorables, or Britain's people are just cowards. There's only one or the other. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, this is a good question. Well, I would begin with what I find most remarkable and admirable about the American Revolution is that if you look at the actual numbers, and this supports your argument, right? In 1776, it is very hard to show that a majority of the colonists actually wanted independence. What happened was that you had a group of very dedicated people, right, around the founding fathers, who more or less forced everyone to go along with them, or a significant number then people moved to Canada who wanted to remain part of the realm of Her Majesty. But the comparison is a good one, because it tells me that I guess the British were just as surprised as they are now with things that's happening within their own country. That all of a sudden you have this group of warmongers or rebel rousers who are just no longer willing to get along with the program. In addition to this, however, I would say when we take something like the grooming gangs, I don't believe this would have been on that scale. I don't believe this would have been possible in the 19th century or in the 18th century, because the kind of pressure towards conformity that was applied onto society was one that would have made this almost unthinkable. I mean, I give you a very concrete example. I always find this quite fascinating. I think up until, because it fits so nicely with the grooming gang issue, I believe up until the mid 17th, early 18th century, I think even a little bit later, some numbers say it was more than 50%. Let us be more generous, say it was below 50% of prostitutes in London were below the age of 14. So it was more or less legal pedophilia. I think that's the only way to describe it. And then what happened was that all of a sudden you had groups of people within the English society, and some of them they said were picking up falling angels and whatever you want to call it, who said this is not right, and everybody who thinks this is right basically will teach them that it isn't. And then they changed society. And what they ultimately created, which I still find is one of the greatest creation ever to be made, was the British gentleman. Right, the whole enchilada. Well, I guess they didn't have much Mexican food at the time, but you know what I mean, right? This idea that there is a certain code of conduct, ideally independent of your socioeconomic status, that you should try to live up to. And this is, I have a lot of nostalgia for this, so I may be exaggerating slightly in the positive direction, but this was there. It is, to me, absolutely fascinating to observe how surprisingly stable the Western nations were in times of tremendous political, social, and demographic upheaval. I mean, there was, as I said before, there were many crises, but ultimately they managed them quite well, because there was a crisis of migration. Very often it was emigration, not immigration, although in the United States you had both. There was an explosion in population. There was the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of the working class, and yet somehow, despite all these changes, I would say that we came out of it as a morally better society than we went into it. It all then went to shambles after World War I, right? And we can talk about this as well. But this is quite impressive. I think the reason, I think Western history is remarkable in the way it dealt with crises, and very often came out better on the other end. And there was this moral element to it. I think lots of this, and these were, to be very clear, these elements were fed by Christianity. I mean, this is the other big problem, right? I think this is what and we talked about as well. This is what I sometimes accuse the Enlightenment of, and I have a lot of patience for the Enlightenment. But what the Enlightenment did, what it did, it took Christianity, stripped God away, and then tried to put it on a purely rational footing. And I think we now experience the failing of this, because Christian morality does, whether the God element is a very important one. I mean, we ran the experiment. I mean, this was the big question, right, that Francis Fukuyama asked in his End of History. That is, is it possible that you discover certain moral rules through Christianity, but then everybody can have them and apply them even without the Christian underpinning? And I think we are increasingly coming to the answer, and the answer is no.
Yeah, I agree. That's how this experiment has gone awry. We were told that, look, you Christians can believe your spiritual, theological mumbo jumbo, go ahead. But the ethical system's good, and we're going to adopt it without it, okay? And this is where you get all these ideas, which we have to be nice to the Pakistanis and the Muslims. We were bad to them. Now it's our turn. Okay, so that's the stripped portion. But when you do that, because it loses balance, okay, it loses meaning, because God is truth. Now, and this is what leads to relativism. So when you strip it like that of its actual, theological context, then this is now when you're left with relativism. And if anything, you get abused and you get exploited. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening to formerly Christian populations in Britain and in Europe in general, because they have the residue, the residual leftovers of Christianity, but they don't have the frame, okay, that holds it together. And I think they're being exploited and they're dying for it. And I actually think it's kind of amazing that despite all the hard work of, the powers that be to secularize people, it seems to me that there is kind of a return to a robust form of Christianity, which to me is the only form of Christianity that ever really existed, like authentic Christianity. I'm seeing that a lot with a lot of young men, a lot of young women who realize that, all our problems kind of go back to that. If we would reclaim our heritage, our religious heritage, and our morality, first and foremost, like I said, all these problems could not be. Okay, if you had, if you brought the same elements in Britain, the same evil authorities in government, and they are, okay, and you brought the same Muslims and the Pakistanis, and they thought the same way, but it was 100 years earlier, or even 200 years, and you had that culture, nothing would happen, except the Pakistanis would get in line and be very nice and just drive taxis and not do anything else, okay? So a lot of it has to do with just the watering down the culture and the exploitation of the little leftover part of Christianity, which is, I have to be nice. I have to just treat everyone nicely and don't judge and just fall down and walk all over me. And it's very masochistic. It's very disgusting. It's very unappealing. I don't blame that so many. I often hear people are leaving the church. I don't blame them because that's not a church. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. That is so very true. No, this is again. It's these days. It's being a Catholic is very difficult these days. I have to admit, because how can you believe in a church that at least some of its most prominent representatives have lost the beliefs themselves? It's
exactly. And this is the Catholic Church, which was once headed by, this is who launched the Crusades, okay, because they cared about the defense of Christians, even overseas.
And I think it was Pope Francis who once again, I don't mean to speak ill of anybody who's no longer with us, but he said that Christianity is not the only way towards salvation. Well, listen. It's fine if I say that or if somebody else says that, but the Pope probably shouldn't. I mean, this is like you join I don't know, a New York Knicks fan club, and the president of the fan club says, you can't cheer for the New York Knicks, but you don't really have to. If you like another team better, it's also fine.
Yeah. You're the one guy in the world who should be like, stick with us, everyone else is wrong. And you're like, yeah, go ahead, dude, do whatever you want. I mean, honestly, look, if we call ourselves Christians, and it's time for us to realize that the Christian element and component is part of politics, and we're seeing it right now. It's easy, and we were taught to keep your religion to yourself, but politics is a secular thing. But man, the more I look at it, the more it just reflects a sort of warfare, a spiritual warfare that was foretold from of old, that is recorded. I've said this before. The main thing that's ever brought me back towards Christianity has been looking at the world and saying, like, wow, this is exactly what the Bible is talking about, even though most people don't even interpret it that way. They're caught up in like, I have to say a formula about Jesus and resurrection. Okay, but if you really look at it, it's kind of like everything is and the lies, the deception. This is what I deal with, especially the historical lies. When you look at history and how it's being taught, it's not just that something's omitted. It's like everything is upside down and you're being fed a complete revert. Not it's not correct. It's the exact reversal of the truth. So in my field, Islam and Christians, everyone is taught, Muslims were good guys until the Christians came and ruined it all. Oh, it's actually the opposite. The Muslims conquered all their lands and killed them and abused them for centuries. And then you had the Crusades. And what I'm saying is this is just one element. So imagine if you did a deep dive, and I'm already starting to do that, in different aspects of history, and their lies too. And they deal with more important and deeper topics that actually affect societies and civilizations. And they're all lied. They're all lies. And this is why Europeans and Westerners and Americans imbibe this in their youth, because they're indoctrinated, because public school systems are indoctrination systems, public, TV's indoctrination, and they're told all the lies. And so they become jaundiced and they hate their own heritage, and then they try to make it up to everyone, and they think life is about being liberal and enjoying it and being promiscuous. And then lo and behold, what happens. It's so this is what I'm trying to say. It's such an orchestrated, diabolical, intentional thing. I can no longer see what's happening as just, this is politics, this is just circumstances, it's not guided. It is.
No, this has been, I would argue, this has been going on for quite a while. It was Nietzsche who says there are three types of history, right? There's monumental history, antiquarian history, and critical history. And I think precisely what you said, he lays it out quite nicely, at least when he talks about history. I think Nietzsche makes this wonderful point that it says you can do history as, going to the archives and just try to identify the historical record. But then, of course, there's also history as an inspiration. So you admire the past as an obligation towards the future, that you say you want to aspire to be like a George Washington or Winston Churchill, or take your pick. And then there's this third kind of thing we have now, which is critical history, which just tries to tear everything down. But going back to what you said before about the American founding, but of course, if I tear down the heroes of the past, I no longer have any aspiration to be a hero in the future. And this is, I think, a massive, massive problem. There have been individuals, I would argue, that truly have been larger than life. And if you look at the biography of George Washington, he is an absolutely remarkable figure. Or as George III, who was basically his antagonist, said, probably one of the greatest men who've ever lived. It's 100% true. These people, these individuals, both male and female, they do exist. But by negating their existence, we are basically saying there have never been heroes in the past, so there will never be heroes in the future. The world is just how it is, and it can never change. And you demoralize. I mean, this is, for me, the biggest issue. The degree of demoralization we experience in our societies is beyond the pale. And for me, this is one of the biggest. And I think relativism is just another term for this. I think relativism is both the cause but also a consequence of this demoralization. Because if everybody's the same, if all the things that we consider to be elevating, to be inspiring, are just made up, well, then what's the point? And how often do you hear young people say this these days? Yeah, what's the point? But you cannot live your life by that. This is not a horizon to strive towards. If you say, nah, as I said, what's the point? There needs to be a point. And whether you find it I find it in this, I guess the term is, I think the term has been abused, so I have to be careful when I use it, but in the form of Christian nationalism, right? I think that God did create nations, and this is an obligation for us. And I take comfort and the calling in saying it is so important that, in essence, these nations continue to exist. I understand that Austria will be different in 200 years than it is now, but I want it to be a natural evolution. I don't want it to be replaced by something completely differently. I think civilizations that die out, I think, Egypt is a very good example. I think that Egyptian traditional, if you want, antique Egyptian civilization is no longer with us in a sense. I think is quite tragic. There are a lot of, I guess, good things that have
it's completely Arabized. Yeah. Your point though about the taking down of heroes, I think this is very important. This was the reason I wrote my book, Defenders of the West, and I looked at all these different Christian European heroes who, ironically, if you listen to the popular history or if you watch movies about them, are they're portrayed as like really unsavory types, like King Richard, Lionheart, of course, another Brit. And when you look at the actual primary contemporary sources, these people were just amazing. They're full of faith, full of courage, full of just perseverance and sacrifice, and all the sorts of things that Western people, as Christians especially, when they read, it's just so mobilizing, so inspiring, and it's real. Oftentimes these stories, as I say, often the lives of these men, what Hollywood comes up with, which is fake, it has nothing on it. The stuff that these guys went through which is recorded, could make a blockbuster, amazing movie, and it would be real. It would actually be grounded in the sources, but they will never do it because it will actually make Americans and Europeans and Christian heritage people actually get inspired and actuated by their faith. And so that's completely shut down. So overall, my ultimate point is, you're right that, the West has a long tradition of heroes and men who sacrifice, and women, but they've been intentionally, and this is why I always go back and say this is by design. They've been all intentionally scrubbed and taken down and erased and demonized, because you, as a European, as a Westerner, have no one ever to look up to, because they're all evil, they're all racist, and and now you need to make it up to the entire world. And this is again once more why I just say it's really diabolical what's happening. I can no longer, like I did a few years ago or a decade ago, think this is just natural developments. It's just so guided. It's so always the absolute worst way that it's just evil.
I think that's true, but I would just add, it goes further back than we're often willing to admit. Just to give a concrete example, if you take somebody like John Locke, right, who speaks about reasonable Christianity, which is basically a watered down form of Christianity. So a lot, when correctly people say a lot of this is by design, I agree, but the design is much more, because there's the Coudenhove-Kalergi plan and all of this. I think the design goes back much further.
I agree with you. I think what's happening is, I think it goes back centuries. I think it goes back millennia. But I think it's accelerating because the more that people give in, and I think a lot of it has to do with the modern form of technology, which has really seeped in and indoctrinated people in a way that it could not 100 years ago, because everything I know is what I see in my local village. You know what I mean? But now people are just born and all they know is what they see on a screen, and it goes into their head. So I do believe it's very old, but I think it's really accelerated in the modern era due especially to technology.
I mean, the idea, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would add as an argument, the idea, if you go back to John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and others, and I believe that I actually like Hobbes quite a bit. I think they were well intended. Was that if
Leviathan.
we make if we make relativism in a sense, the law of the land or the culture of the day. If you mentioned this before, right? There were times when people fought over flags, they fought over ideas, they fought over beliefs. Now, if you could make everyone believe that there is nothing worth fighting for, that it's that life is all there is, that you can only enjoy the present time,
the only thing worth fighting for is freedom for me to be promiscuous, eat junk food, and do drugs and drink alcohol. Because that today is what freedom means, right?
Yes, you're absolutely.
Who's going to fight and die for that? Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. And I think this is where they were wrong. I still believe they were well intended. This is where they were, because it turns out that it is somewhat empty. All right, it is having 4 wives and 4 cheeseburgers every day. It's not the same, because you mentioned, if you take the Persian Wars, right, and you read what Herodotus writes about the phalanx, and he describes how the soldiers march forward and how many of them soil themselves, and yet they keep on marching. It's something you really say, I don't want to experience it, but there is a part of me that says, I wonder if faced with potential death, if this isn't the moment where you feel the most alive. Again, I'm not trying, but you know what I mean, right?
It's fighting for something greater than yourself, which we're not taught anymore, because our self is the greatest thing, and it's not worth fighting for. You see? All right, Ralph, I know it's really late for you, and I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks for joining me. We'll do it again.
Thanks for having me. This was amazing.
Yeah. It's always great talking with you. I'll contact you again. We'll do it again. I might do a part 2, and we can go from there. So thanks for staying up for me, and good night.
Anytime. Thanks to you, and thanks to all of you as listeners.
All right. Awesome. Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Okay. That was Ralph Schoellhammer. Be sure to check him out. Follow him on his Twitter, X, Facebook. Great guy. I met him when I was in Budapest.